Hi, everybody. Tonight, I'd like to invite you on a quiet journey, deep into the folds of time, into a world cobbled in stone, lit by flickering lanterns, and shrouded in a heavy silence, broken only by whispers of prayer and grief. Our story drifts softly across fog-laden streets and lonely meadows of medieval Europe, where under cathedral shadows and thatched rooftops, an unseen force crept like a chill through door cracks and under beams. It is the tale of a sickness, so silent, so swift, and so sorrowful, that it would scar the memory of an age and redraw the map of the living. This is the story of why the Black Death was so brutal in medieval times. But we shall not begin in dread. No, our tale opens in peace. For understanding the terror that came requires first a glimpse into the gentle world that preceded it. Tonight, we find ourselves in the year 1346. A year like many others on the surface, where the world moved with the slow rhythm of soil and sun. A time when the land bore witness to quiet rituals, modest dreams, and the soft breath of life in its most unadorned form. The earth turned steadily through the seasons. In spring, fields burst with wildflowers and the bleating of newborn lambs. Summer ripened the wheat under a golden sky, the grain dancing in the wind. Autumn brought its bounty, apples, wine, and the scent of turned earth. Winter blanketed villages in silence, where families gathered around hearths, sharing broth, bread, and stories passed down through generations. This was not a time of ease or plenty, but one of pattern and perseverance, a time when each year looked much like the last, and such sameness offered comfort to those who had little else. Across Europe, small communities nestled into valleys and hillsides, hemmed in by woods and rivers. Houses were built of stone and wattle, roofs of thatch and wood. The rhythm of life was dictated by bells from the monastery or the village church. They rang for prayer, for labor, for birth, for death. Each toll was familiar. Every sound had meaning. The people lived close to the land and to each other. They rose with the sun and slept with the stars. In these quiet corners, life was shared and simple. Bread was kneaded at dawn, baked in communal ovens where village women laughed and traded news. Fields were tilled by hand, oxen pulling heavy plows through dark soil. Children fetched water from wells, watched over younger siblings, and chased geese through muddy paths. The air smelled of smoke, animals, and earth. Nights were dark, but never empty, for the fire's glow and the presence of kin held back the shadows. Religion wrapped itself around every part of life. Faith was not questioned, it simply was. Crosses were carved into doorframes. Saints, days marked the calendar more than seasons did. Illness and crop failure were seen as signs of divine displeasure. Success was a blessing, suffering a test. Pilgrimages were taken, relics kissed, indulgences bought. In every church, a candle flickered for the soul of a loved one, and prayers rose like mist in the morning. And still, beyond the edges of this modest world, forces were moving, unseen, unheeded. Along the winding roads of trade, through dusty deserts and mountain passes, across seas and rivers, death had begun its slow march. It began in whispers, distant and strange. A merchant fell ill in Sarai, far to the east. A caravan master coughed blood near the Caspian. Townspeople in Tabriz buried their dead in silence. The stories, when they came, were too far away to touch the European mind. After all, how often did the troubles of Asia reach the ears of an English shepherd or a Tuscan farmer? But the world was more connected than it seemed. Though news moved slowly, people did not. Traders crossed continents. Sailors docked in port after port. Mongol riders galloped with messages and goods. And with them came the fleas, tiny, clinging things. They nestled in furs, in sacks of grain, in the dark folds of ships' bellies. On the backs of black rats, they traveled far unnoticed. In 1347, in the Crimean port of Kaffa, these two worlds met, east and west. The city was under siege by Mongol forces, who themselves were stricken by plague. As the story goes, the besiegers, desperate and dying, hurled the corpses of their infected dead over the city walls, sending rot and sickness tumbling into the crowded streets. The Genoese merchants within fled in terror, sailing back across the Black Sea. But they did not flee alone. The rats came with them. So did the fleas. So did the plague. By the time the first infected ships docked in Messina, in Sicily, it was too late. The disease had arrived, a silent rider among the cargo. And from there it would spread with terrifying speed, leaping from city to city, from house to house, carried on breath, on fur, on the air itself. But in this, our first night, we will not yet follow it. We remain for now in the world that was, unknowing and unafraid. In the south of France, in a village near Avignon, a girl carries a jug of water from the stream, singing a lullaby her mother once sang to her. In a monastery near Prague, a scribe copies an illuminated manuscript, golden ink gleaming beneath the candlelight. In London, a baker's apprentice yawns beneath the rising steam of morning loaves. None of them know what is coming. None can imagine the weeping that will echo through these same streets a year hence. And so, for tonight, we linger. We listen to the nightingales in the hedgerows. We watch the moon pass behind clouds. We smell the wood smoke curling from chimneys. All is quiet. All is ordinary. And that is what makes what follows so very devastating. The calm before a storm is a sacred thing. It is the last moment of unknowing. And so let us breathe with these people, just for a while longer. Let us sit beside their hearts, drink their ale, listen to their songs. Let us remember the world as it was, before the shadows deepened and the silence changed its shape. The year turned as it always had, and with it the seasons drifted forward, gentle and slow. Winter whispered across the land with its pale fingers, frosting the eaves of cottages and stilling the waters of rivers. In village squares, footprints lingered in the snow, and the smoke from hearths rose in soft, curling plumes, painting the sky in muted grays. Life carried on as it always had, unaware of the silent harbinger drawing ever nearer. In January of 1348, the sea brought strange tidings to the harbors of southern Europe. The port of Messina in Sicily stirred to life with the usual clamor, fishermen hauling nets, traders unloading barrels, children darting between crates in play. But when the Genoese ships arrived, a hush fell over the dockyards. The sailors stumbled from their vessels, not with cheer or song, but with fevered eyes and trembling limbs. Some did not walk at all, but were dragged ashore by companions who would soon collapse beside them. They were dying, and no one understood why. The townsfolk looked on in dread as bodies were carried off, limp and soaked in sweat, faces blotched with blackened sores. At first, the city did what cities do. They prayed, they isolated the sick, they sought divine mercy. But the sickness did not stop. It crept from house to house, sparing none. The friars buried the dead in hurried masses, their chants rising above the moans of the afflicted. And soon the gates of Messina were closed, not against an army, but against something far more insidious. But it was too late. The Genoese ships did not stop with Sicily. They scattered like autumn leaves in the wind, bearing their cursed cargo to every port they touched. From Marseille to Genoa, from Pisa to Tunis, the plague spread, tracing the web of trade and kinship across the Mediterranean. In each new city, the pattern repeated. Sailors falling ill, townspeople succumbing, and confusion reigning. There were no doctors who could heal, no saints who answered prayers quickly enough. Europe, at the dawn of 1348, had no frame for this kind of death. Illness was familiar, yes. Fevers came with the seasons. Children sometimes faded with the cold. But this was different. The Black Death did not wait. It arrived like a thief in the night, and within days, a family could be wiped out. The symptoms were grotesque and terrifying. High fevers, vomiting, painful swellings in the groin and armpits, buboes as they came to be known, followed by a blackening of the skin and then, all too often, death. Sometimes it happened in a week, sometimes in a day. In the countryside, word spread like wildfire. Riders brought tales of whole parishes emptied in days, of priests collapsing mid-sermon, of gravediggers who no longer returned from the fields of the dead. And yet, for a time, many still believed they would be spared. It was a distant storm, terrible to hear of, but not yet felt on their own skin. In a small town nestled among the hills of Tuscany, a merchant named Matteo watched the road with growing unease. He had heard the stories, of course. Everyone had. But now his cousin had written from Florence, begging for help, for sanctuary. The city was overwhelmed, she said. The dead lined the streets, their bodies unattended. Dogs roamed free, feasting on what had once been masters. And worst of all, the air itself seemed poisoned, thick with the stench of decay and incense. Matteo showed the letter to his wife, and together they wept. But what could be done? If he opened his doors, he might bring the sickness into their home. If he closed them, he might leave his cousin to die. These were the choices now. not between good and evil, but between terror and despair. Elsewhere, in a Benedictine monastery in the heart of Burgundy, Brother Etienne recorded the events in his parchment journal. His script was careful, each line penned in ink made from oak galls and iron salts. The entries began with concern, then fear, then a kind of numbed resignation. March the 3rd, he wrote. We buried Father Henri today. He had not risen from his pallet since last Sabbath. His breath grew shallow, his skin darkened like bruised fruit. We burned his habit and washed his cell with vinegar, but already Brother Thomas coughs. The bells do not stop ringing. These entries, left behind by men who had no hope of understanding the nature of the disease, would one day serve as our map to sorrow. But in their time, they were simply the voices of those trying to keep order as their world unraveled. In Paris, the universities debated the cause. Learned men sat in cloisters, cloaked against the chill, drawing diagrams of planetary alignments and writing treatises on corrupted air. One physician claimed it was caused by the position of Saturn in Aquarius. Another believed it was divine punishment for the sins of the people. A third recommended that cities be cleared of bad smells and that citizens carry sweet herbs in their pockets. But nothing they did could stem the tide. The plague advanced steadily northward, through France and into the German states, through Switzerland and beyond the Alps. It moved not like a slow river, but like fire in dry grass, igniting town after town. By April, it had reached Avignon, the seat of the papacy, and Pope Clement VI found himself encircled by death. He sat each day between two blazing fires, believing the heat would purify the air around him. It may have saved him. It did not save many others, and still the people waited for the worst to pass. They lit candles in chapels, offered alms to beggars, fasted, and made vows. In some cities, groups of penitents walked barefoot through the streets, whipping themselves bloody as they sang hymns of repentance, believing that suffering might appease God's wrath. But the plague did not pause for piety. By midsummer of 1348, entire towns stood silent. Fields went unharvested, bells rang for no one. And yet, the plague was only beginning. The world they had known, the world of feast days, of maypole dances, of baptisms and market songs, was slipping away. A new world was taking shape, dark and uncertain, where death was no longer a visitor, but a constant companion. In the quiet of night, in a cottage near the Welsh border, a mother sat awake beside her fevered child. She had no remedies, no learned words. She only sang the lullaby her own mother had once sung, her voice breaking as the child coughed. Outside, the stars blinked indifferently in the sky, and the wind carried the sound of distant weeping. The storm had arrived, and it had only just begun. By the turn of autumn in 1348, the roads of Europe bore witness to a grim procession. What had once been paths for merchants and pilgrims were now trodden by the desperate, the displaced, and the dying. Fleeing villagers sought refuge in forests, in caves, in hills they thought untouched by the scourge. But the plague, invisible and unrelenting, had no need of walls to pass through or banners to announce its arrival. It traveled in silence, borne on breath and fur, seeping into the cracks of civilization like water through stone. In the once prosperous town of Florence, there was little left of order or beauty. The city, famed for its marble facades and marketplaces overflowing with velvet and gold, now echoed with cries and the hollow hush of abandonment. Doors were marked with chalk crosses. Shutters were nailed closed. The streets, once busy with scholars and merchants, were littered with refuse and human bodies alike. The smell, a pungent blend of death, incense, and rotting food, hung thick in the air, unshakable. In a high-windowed home overlooking the Arno River, a young woman named Isabetta lingered in the stillness of her father's study. The house was quiet now, too quiet. Her father, a well-respected physician, had succumbed days before. Her mother had followed not long after. Isabetta had tried to care for them both, had washed their faces with lavender water, and whispered prayers in the old Latin tongue. But their eyes had clouded all the same. She sat now in silence, watching dust motes float in the sunbeams. Her hands rested on the worn spine of a manuscript her father had once read to her, a treatise on the humors of the body. He had believed in balance, of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and had sought to restore health through leeches, baths, and herbal drafts. Yet nothing he tried had worked. Not the ground myrrh, not the heated stones, not even the prayers. From her window, she watched the carts roll by, grim processions pulled by tired oxen. They came at dawn and again at dusk, driven by masked men who called for the dead in droning voices. "Bring out your dead," they cried. It had become a lullaby of sorts, haunting and rhythmic, echoing through alleyways. The carts paused outside each home, and the mourners, if any were left, dragged bodies wrapped in linen to be taken away. There was no ceremony, no last rites, only the sound of hooves and the slow grinding of wheels on stone. Beyond Florence, the countryside fared little better. Small villages, tucked between vineyards and olive groves, began to vanish from the maps. A whole hamlet might fall silent in a week, its fields growing wild, its livestock wandering untended. Strangers passing by would find doors left ajar, fires long dead in the hearths, toys and tools still lying where they had last been touched. Even the birds seemed to avoid those places, as if instinct warned them of the stillness that meant death. In one such village, nestled in the green slopes of Provence, a friar named Père Guillaume walked alone through the churchyard. His brown robe was stained with ash and wine, remnants of his attempts at purification and comfort. The graves were fresh, each marked with nothing more than a wooden stake. He no longer had the strength to carve names. There were too many, and besides, names had started to lose their meaning. He paused by the last open grave, the soil still damp, the scent of earth overpowering even the sweet basil he had tucked into his sleeves. In his hand was a small cross, carved by a child who had once sat in the front pew every Sunday. Guillaume closed his eyes and whispered, "Requiescat in pace," before dropping the cross into the grave. Then, with slow, aching movements, he began to fill it. He had not spoken to another living soul in days. His fellow friars had all perished. The villagers had either fled or joined the dead. And yet he remained, not out of hope, but out of duty. His faith, tested beyond all reckoning, had become a quiet, stubborn thing, like the embers of a fire refusing to die. Elsewhere in London, the plague arrived not with great announcement, but in shadows. A dockworker collapsed beside a shipment of Flemish cloth. Then his wife, then his children. The homes along Thames Street darkened one by one, their doors barred from the inside. Within a fortnight, the Lord Mayor was writing frantic orders, demanding the removal of the sick to the outskirts, the fumigation of houses, the punishment of those who failed to report illness. But panic spread faster than law. The streets emptied, the courts closed, the ringing of coins gave way to the tolling of bells, and those who could fled, to the countryside, to monasteries, to nowhere in particular, so long as it was away. Nobles and merchants alike found that titles and coin offered no immunity. And through all of it, rumors spread like wildfire, that the stars had shifted and cursed the earth, that a foul wind had risen from the east, that Jews had poisoned wells, or that witches had summoned the plague with cursed charms. Fear needed a face, and in its desperation, it fashioned enemies from neighbors. Pogroms erupted in Strasbourg, Mainz, and other towns along the Rhine. Hundreds were burned, drowned, or driven out, all in the hope that such cruelty might somehow appease the pestilence. But the plague did not pause. The truth, of course, was hidden in the bite of fleas, in the bodies of rats, in the breath of the infected. But such truths were beyond the knowing of that time. And so, as the leaves turned red and gold in the autumn of 1348, Europe burned with fever, suspicion, and grief. And yet, amid the darkness, small flickers of humanity endured. In a convent near Bruges, a sister named Agnes wrote letters each night by candlelight, not to be sent but to be read by no one. In them, she recorded the names of the dead, along with small memories, a laugh, a kindness, a song once sung. They must not vanish utterly, she wrote, her ink smudged by tears. God sees them still. In these quiet acts of remembrance, in whispered prayers, in the holding of hands even in the final hours, there lay a stubborn resistance. Not to the plague, but to forgetting, to allowing the dead to become mere numbers in a tally of despair. The Black Death raged on unyielding, but so too did the human heart, fragile and flickering though it was, trying still to love, to mourn, and to remember. The first snow fell early in the winter of 1348, cloaking the ruined villages and silent roads of Europe in a hush deeper than death. It softened the shapes of abandoned carts and shuttered homes, blanketing the broken world in a false purity. In towns where bells had once rung for vespers and feast days, only the wind spoke now, sighing through crooked doorways and over unmarked graves. The plague had not vanished with the cold. It merely changed its pace, lingering in breath, in cloth, in the crevices of stone and straw. In the highlands of Bavaria, nestled among frost-rimed pines, the hamlet of Ebersdorf lay as if holding its breath. Smoke no longer rose from most chimneys. The chapel door, once open from matins till sundown, stood ajar and unguarded. Inside, the altar was bare, the pews empty. Only a single candle flickered before the crucifix, lit that morning by a woman named Gertrude, the last of her kin. She had buried her husband beneath the frozen earth with her own hands, having found no one left to help. Her sons had fallen days before him, their limbs burning with fever, their cries echoing through the timber-framed house long after their souls had passed. She did not weep now. The tears had long since dried, replaced by a silence so complete it rang in her ears like a distant bell. Each morning, Gertrude walked the path between her home and the chapel, her feet crunching the crusted snow, her breath rising in little clouds. She did not pray aloud anymore. Her voice had begun to sound strange to her, too loud in a world so quiet. But she carried her grief like a relic, and her steps, deliberate and slow, were their own kind of devotion. Elsewhere in the heart of Prague, a scholar named Pavel kept vigil by the light of a single oil lamp. His study, once a chamber of lively debate and ink-stained scrolls, had become a tomb of books and silence. He had locked himself away since the university shuttered its doors, sending students fleeing into the countryside. Food came rarely now, left at the door by frightened servants who no longer lingered to speak. Pavel filled his days with writing, not sermons or treatises, but letters to those already gone. To his wife, who had perished in May, he wrote of dreams they once shared. To his students, of lessons unfinished. To his daughter, whom he had not held in nearly a year, he wrote each morning as though she might return any moment, laughing as she used to, tugging at his robes for one more tale. "Dearest Annika," he wrote one night, "if you read this, know that the stars still burn above us, indifferent but eternal. Know that your voice still lives in these pages, in the echo of every word I now pen. If memory is a kind of resurrection, then you are not lost to me." It was this quiet thread, memory, that began to bind the scattered souls of Europe. With churches emptied of priests and cathedrals silent but for wind, the people turned inward, crafting their own rituals in the face of death. Some gathered at crossroads, lighting lanterns and singing the old psalms. Others scrawled symbols of protection over their doors, mixing folk beliefs with the sacred. Mothers murmured charms as they wrapped their children in wool, while widowers carved names into trees and stones, seeking permanence in a world undone. And through it all, the plague marched on. In Bruges, in Ghent, in the vast merchant city of Lübeck, it came as it always did, with fever, with blood, with fear. The rich, who once believed their money would guard them, fell like the rest. Silk sheets and silver goblets meant nothing in the face of swollen buboes and failing lungs. Physicians, clad in their long-beaked masks and heavy robes, became as feared as the disease itself. Their arrival meant death was already near. Their treatments, leeches, bloodletting, aromatic pomanders, did little more than delay the inevitable. Some turned to flight. Wealthy families packed their carts and sought refuge in mountain retreats or remote monasteries, but often they brought the sickness with them. A single servant, a single threadbare cloak infected with the unseen pestilence, was enough to seed a new outbreak. In England, the winds of the Channel carried not only the salt of the sea, but rumors of doom. By December, the southern ports were bracing for the worst. The plague had already reached Southampton and was moving inland. In the rolling downs near Winchester, a young novice named Thomas watched the horizon from his cell window each night, counting the stars and wondering which would still shine by spring. His monastery, once bustling with chants and the scraping of pens across vellum, was now eerily still. The abbot had died 3 days prior. Only a handful of monks remained, too frightened or too faithful to flee. Thomas, though scarcely more than a boy, took to copying psalms in the cold scriptorium, each letter a prayer for protection. "Domine, refugium factus es nobis," he wrote, the ink blotting with tears he did not let fall. "Lord, you have been our refuge from generation to generation." He did not know whether the words would be read. Perhaps they would be buried with him. But writing was a form of defiance, against despair, against forgetting, against the silence creeping through their cloisters. By year's end, the plague had wrapped much of Europe in its shroud. No region was untouched, no household safe. Yet still, beneath the snow and ash, embers glowed. A woman in Aragon boiled rosemary and sage, singing to the herbs in a tongue older than Latin. A shepherd in the Pyrenees carved tiny crosses into the bark of trees, one for each of his lost kin. A child in Dublin lit a candle each night, staring into its flame as if it might speak. The Black Death showed no mercy. But mercy, as it turned out, still flickered in human hearts, in the persistence of memory, in acts of kindness, in hands held until the last breath. Winter passed, and the world did not end. It only grew quieter, waiting to see what would remain when spring returned. As the snows of early 1349 began to thaw, the land did not rejoice as it once might have. Spring had always been a time of renewal, of crocus bulbs breaking through frost-hardened soil, of lambs tottering in sun-dappled meadows, of bells pealing in celebration of Easter. But this spring arrived under a sky dulled by sorrow and silence. Where once children had danced around maypoles and villagers had sown fields with song, now the air held only the soft sigh of wind across empty thresholds and the uneasy hush of the living, waiting for death to pass them by. In the cathedral city of York, the minster's great bells hung motionless in their towers. The clergy, what few remained, held mass in the crypt, their chants echoing against cold stone, unanswered by a congregation that had all but vanished. The bishop had died in February, buried hastily in the chapter house under a slab too hastily carved to bear his name. And so a lesser prior now led the rites, his voice thin with grief, his eyes hollow from nights spent reading psalms by the flickering light of a single taper. Outside the walls, a girl named Alice lived in the bones of what had once been a bustling merchant household. The servants had all gone, either to the grave or in flight. Her elder brother, once bound for Oxford, lay in the upper chamber, wrapped in linen that had once been used for feast day tablecloths. Her mother had passed in the winter's deepest cold, and now Alice tended to what remained: a few chickens, a sack of oats, and her own beating heart. Each morning, she lit a small fire in the hearth, not for warmth, but for company. She read aloud from her father's Bible, the words trembling in her voice though no one listened. She swept the floor though no one passed through. She tied her brother's old cap about her head and stared out the window for long stretches, watching for travelers who never came. She had begun in her solitude to speak with the house itself. To the table where her family once broke bread, she whispered memories. To the threshold, she begged protection. To the portrait of St. Julian that hung by the stairs, she confided her fears. In this way, the silence became less monstrous. She filled it with pieces of herself. Meanwhile, in the marshes of Flanders, the village of Saint-Liévin had become a ghost of itself. The fields, untended since harvest, lay brown and desolate. The wind dragged itself through the skeletal remains of wheat, scattering chaff like ashes. In the rectory, a widower named Ivo had taken to ringing the church bell each day at noon, even though no one came. The bell, its voice rough with rust, cried out into emptiness. It was not a summons, but a remembrance. A cry that someone was still there, still alive, still trying. Ivo had lost his wife and both sons. He had found them one morning, slumped together by the hearth, their faces peaceful in sleep that never ended. He did not touch them. He lit candles and opened every window. Then he sat in the doorway until sunset, listening to the sound of the river and waiting for God to speak. God did not speak, but the river did, its murmur carrying stories in a language he did not understand. And so each day, Ivo rang the bell and listened to the water, keeping vigil not just for his own family, but for all who had gone. Northward, in the wilds of Scotland, the plague had crept like a wolf through scattered villages. The Highlands, thought safe by virtue of their remoteness, had proven no sanctuary. The sickness did not heed geography. It found paths through trade, through soldiers, through traveling monks and fugitives alike. A clan chieftain, Domhnall mac Coinach, watched the valley below his keep with grim eyes. Fires had gone out in the cottages, the smoke of peat long since faded. His kin, once too many to count, were now few. Those who survived walked with bowed heads and muttered prayers in the old tongue, as though Gaelic itself might guard them where Latin had failed. Domnall forbade mourning rituals, not out of cruelty, but from a deeper understanding. If they wailed for every loss, they would never stop wailing. Instead, he gathered the survivors each morning and recited a single line, the Beathana Tiodlak. Life is a gift, that was all. Then they went about their tasks, chopping wood, herding the remaining sheep, boiling mosses and herbs into tinctures they did not understand but clung to anyway. Far to the south, in the city of Avignon, still burdened with the presence of the papal court, the pestilence reached its most furious crescendo. By April, the dead outnumbered the living. The Rhone ran sluggish with runoff from mass graves dug too close to its banks. The smell of lime, used to cover the bodies, rose with every breeze. Pope Clement VI, still ensconced within the palace walls, continued to sit between roaring fires, breathing air thick with frankincense and fear. He issued bulls declaring remission of sins to all who died of the plague, his ink-stained hand trembling with exhaustion. He commissioned endless prayers, fasts, and processions. But deep down, even he knew the limits of words. Salvation was promised, but the bodies still fell. In an orchard outside the city, a young scribe named Leon hid among the trees. He had once copied manuscripts within the papal court, his fingers stained with gold leaf and his eyes weary from the fine script. But when the plague entered the chancery, he fled. Now he lived on apples and herbs, reading aloud to the birds from a psalter he had taken with him. At night, he watched the stars and whispered verses until sleep came. "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death," he would murmur, "I will fear no evil." The valley had grown wide, the shadow deeper than any had imagined. And yet, here and there, voices still rose, quiet, solitary, stubborn. In York, in Saint-Liévin, in the Highlands, and Avignon, souls like Alice, like Ivo, like Domnall and Leon persisted. The plague showed no sign of waning, but neither did the will of the human spirit, flickering like a candle in the wind, refusing, however faintly, to go out. By the early summer of 1349, the plague had carved a path so wide across Europe that few places dared to hope they might be spared. Entire provinces seemed to groan beneath the weight of death. Forest paths were overgrown where no feet had passed in months, fields lay choked with weeds, and wild animals crept boldly through deserted villages, sniffing doorways that no longer opened. In cities and towns alike, the familiar rhythms of life, market days, holy days, weddings, births, had given way to the constant beat of mourning. Yet amid this ruin, some souls clung to order, not out of denial, but from a need to preserve something, anything, of the world that had been. In a small university enclave just outside the city of Paris, an aging professor named Father Renard de Chatillon still rose each morning at dawn. Though his lectures had long since ceased, though his students had fled or died, he continued to speak aloud in the empty hall, his voice reverberating against the vaulted ceiling. He wore his scholar's robes, now patched and faded, and turned the brittle pages of his Aristotle with care, as if truth still lay somewhere between the lines. "It is not suffering that destroys us," he once said to the empty benches, "but the forgetting of purpose." After his reading, he would walk the cloisters, murmuring prayers to the Virgin, and then descend to the kitchen garden, where he tended beans and leeks with hands once meant only for ink. It was a small act of rebellion, this garden, a place where life still sprouted, delicate and green, amid the stink of the city beyond. In that same season, far to the west, the storm reached the coast of Cornwall. There, on the cliff-bound edge of the kingdom, the sea pounded rocks as it always had, indifferent, eternal. But the people were not as they had been. Fishermen no longer cast their nets. The harbor, once full of weather-worn boats and the creak of sails, stood eerily still. In the village of Penhalwen, a healer named Morwenna tended the sick with what herbs remained to her: yarrow, meadowsweet, and horehound. Her cottage, built of stone and driftwood, smelled of smoke, salt, and crushed leaves. People came to her even now, though fewer each day. She offered tinctures, not promises. She did not speak of cures, only of comfort. Her fame had spread beyond the hills, carried on whispered tales. Some said she was descended from the old druids, that she knew the language of trees and the dreams of crows. Others claimed she had walked through a field of plague-ridden dead and emerged untouched. Morwenna did not correct them. She knew that myth could be medicine too. One day, a boy arrived at her door, barefoot, covered in road dust, and cradling a bundle wrapped in his own cloak. Inside lay his little sister, limp as a rag doll, her breath shallow, her skin glazed with sweat. He looked at Morwenna with eyes hollowed by fear and said only, "Please." Morwenna took the child and did what she could. She bathed her in warm water scented with thyme, wrapped her in linen steeped in wine and crushed garlic, and sang to her in the old tongue, soft, steady syllables that sounded like waves. The girl did not wake that night, nor the next. But she lived. The boy returned each day, helping Morwenna in silence, gathering firewood, fetching water, grinding herbs. He spoke little, but he watched her every move. And when the girl finally opened her eyes and whispered his name, he began to cry. Not the loud weeping of grief, but the quiet, shaking sobs of disbelief and release. Morwenna did not comfort him. She simply placed a hand on his shoulder and left him to it. Sometimes, even in the blackest of storms, a single branch remained unbroken. In the north, beyond the stormy wastes of Denmark and into the scattered farms of Sweden, the plague arrived with a slowness that gave false hope. Villagers believed the cold winds would protect them, that the long dark winters had made their blood thick, their lungs strong. But by midsummer, the sickness was in the markets of Stockholm and the monasteries of Uppsala. And from there, it crawled outward like frost upon a window pane. A farmer named Jens, whose land lay near the edge of a pine forest, recorded the losses in a leather-bound book passed down from his grandfather. He wrote not in Latin, but in his own hand, simple, unadorned. He wrote of the cow that had died last winter, of the spring barley that had grown poorly, and now of the people. June 17th, he wrote, "Inger is gone, buried her beside the elder tree, gave her my mother's scarf. She loved the color." And on the next page, June 22, "The child now coughs. I sleep in the barn." Jens did not write for posterity. He wrote because it was the only way to bear witness. If no one remembered, then nothing mattered. South again, in the sun-soaked vineyards of Castile, the plague wore a different mask. The bright days and warm nights did not lessen its hunger. It moved from village to village, devouring the old, the young, the faithful, the wicked. Churches overflowed with bodies. Saints, relics were paraded through the streets, but the dead still fell. Yet in one valley, so remote it did not appear on any royal map, a monk named Alonso sat each evening beneath a fig tree and painted. He had once illuminated Bibles for the bishopric, his fingers deft with gold leaf and sacred geometry. Now he painted on scraps of wood and parchment, using ash mixed with wine for ink. He painted faces, not of saints or kings, but of those who had died. The shoemaker's daughter, the midwife who sang lullabies, the shepherd with a crooked smile. He painted them not as corpses, but as they had been in life, laughing, working, loving. And on the back of each portrait, he wrote a single word, present, present. To remember was to resist the erasure. To name the lost was to say they mattered. All across Europe, in abbeys and hovels, in forests and ports, that same impulse stirred, to remember. Not only to survive, but to carry something forward, some image, some word, some ember of meaning. The Black Death had taken their bodies, but memory, stubborn and slow, still breathed. And so the summer passed, heavy with sorrow, but not yet empty of light. As the harvest season of 1349 approached, the fields of Europe lay in an eerie quiet. Where there should have been the rustle of grain being cut by scythe and the laughter of peasants binding sheaves in the fading sun, there was only stillness. Stalks of wheat stood tall and unharvested, golden and rotting in the wind. The earth, generous as ever, gave forth its bounty, but there were few hands left to gather it. In many villages, the rhythms of the land no longer matched the rhythm of the people. Time still moved forward, but humanity had slowed, hollowed by loss, scattered by fear. The Black Death had not only stolen lives, it had stolen labor, kinship, routine. Fields, once symbols of continuity, now bore witness to absence. In the lowlands of the Netherlands, a village called Vrunten had once been known for its rich barley and fine linen. Now, the looms sat idle, and the barns, once bursting with hay, echoed with the occasional shuffle of rats or the creak of wind-blown timbers. A boy named Peter wandered through the village each day, barefoot and unwashed, with a carved wooden flute hanging around his neck. He never played it, not since his mother's death. Instead, he wandered through fields and gardens, picking over what remained: bruised apples, sprigs of thyme, a crust of bread left beside a doorway. He no longer knocked. If a home had smoke curling from the chimney, he passed it silently, eyes lowered. If not, he crept in and took what he needed. He never stayed long. The dead frightened him less than the possibility of the dying. But there was one home he visited often, a crumbling farmhouse at the edge of the village, where an old woman named Lisbeth still lived. She had known Peter's mother, once helped her through childbirth. Now, with her legs too stiff to walk far, she spent her days in a rocking chair by the window, knitting lengths of wool that no one would wear. When Peter came, she would offer him soup made from herbs and rainwater, and he, in turn, would gather kindling for her fire. They spoke little. Their companionship was stitched in silence, in the gentle rituals of presence. One day, without a word, Peter took out the flute and played a soft, trembling melody, nothing more than a wisp of a song, a memory barely shaped. Lisbeth closed her eyes and smiled. For a moment, something living moved through the air. In the Italian countryside, near Siena, the plague had burned so fiercely through the spring that whole estates had fallen into ruin. Nobles fled to mountaintop villas, leaving behind servants and serfs who died without even a blessing. But the land remained, as land always does, unmoved by human departure. A woman named Beatrice, once a kitchen maid, now found herself alone on the grounds of a once proud estate. She lived in the servants' quarters, the only survivor of a household of 40 souls. At first, she tried to maintain the order of the place, sweeping the halls, airing the linens, boiling water for non-existent baths. But gradually, she stopped. Dust gathered. Ivy crept through broken windows. The house settled into stillness. And yet, Beatrice endured. She milked the goats that had wandered in from neighboring farms. She tended to a small garden, more out of instinct than purpose. She read from the psalter the lady of the house had left behind, her finger tracing each word as though it were a spell. One evening, she climbed the tower where the Lord once surveyed his lands. From there, she saw nothing but green hills and sky, and the faint smoke of a distant village. The air smelled of lavender and ash. For a moment, she felt as though she had stepped beyond time, into a world abandoned by God and man alike. But in that emptiness, she found a strange clarity. She was still here. The world, for all its loss, had not ceased. There were goats to feed, soil to turn, and words to whisper in the stillness. She bowed her head and wept, not from grief, but from the unbearable weight of survival. In the heart of the Polish plains, where the plague had not yet reached in full, rumors arrived ahead of the sickness like crows before a storm. People began to build barriers at the edges of towns, burning strangers' belongings, turning away merchants and pilgrims. Suspicion grew like mold on bread. Neighbors eyed one another with unease. A cough, a fever, a darkened sore, these were no longer symptoms, but sentences. In Krakow, a Jewish physician named Eliezer spent his nights writing by candlelight. He compiled notes, prayers, and remedies, unsure what might help when the plague finally came. He had read of entire communities being destroyed not just by illness, but by fear. He knew the patterns. He had seen letters from Strasbourg, where hundreds of his people had been burned alive for imagined crimes. And so he wrote, not only as a healer, but as a historian. He described the breathless fevers, the bitter debates of the council, the pleas of the poor. But he also recorded acts of kindness. A baker who fed an orphaned family in secret, a priest who defied his bishop to tend to the sick, a child who offered water to a stranger with trembling hands. El Rachum Vashanun, he wrote in Hebrew script. The Lord is merciful and compassionate. And beneath it in Latin, humanitas, etiam in tenebris, humanity, even in darkness. Everywhere, across kingdoms and tongues, that same thread stretched, frail but unbroken. In the midst of ruin, people still look to one another, sometimes with fear, often with sorrow, but sometimes, just sometimes, with grace. As the days grew longer and the sun warmed fields long forgotten, the dead did not rise. But the living, battered and quiet, did not yet fall. The plague had not passed, but the heart, though wounded, still beat. By the late summer of 1349, the plague had begun to curl back from some regions, leaving in its wake a silence far deeper than before. It was not the silence of danger or of hiding, it was the silence of after, of streets that no longer echoed, of beds that no longer held sleepers, of lives that had vanished as though carried off by a tide no eye had seen. Where the plague had moved on, it left emptiness like a hollow bell still ringing in the air. In the valleys of Normandy, the village of Saint-Maurice stood quiet under the weight of the sun. The vines that had once been pruned and trained with careful hands now sprawled wild over their trellises, heavy with grapes no one came to harvest. The stone cottages, sun-warmed and dappled in ivy, bore closed shutters like eyelids in uneasy sleep. In the town square, a single child sat beside the fountain. Her name was Isabeau, and she was the daughter of the village miller, though that word, daughter, meant little now. Her parents had died weeks apart, buried in graves behind the chapel, marked only by stones she had carried herself. Since then, she had remained, not out of courage, but because she did not know where else to go. Each day, she walked to the fountain and dipped her hands into the water. She watched the ripples fan outward, watched the sunlight tremble in the shallows. Sometimes, she would speak to the water, telling it about the dreams she'd had, of her mother's voice, of flour dust and apple pies, of rain on the mill's wooden roof. The water never answered, but she spoke all the same. On the edge of the village lived an old man named Thomas, a cooper by trade, though he had not made a barrel in many months. He too had lost all he loved, his wife, his apprentices, the neighbors who once joined him for wine and songs. And yet, each morning, he rose, lit a candle, and opened his shutters. He swept his stoop. He nodded to the chapel, now empty of priest and prayer. He did these things because he always had, and because doing them meant that not everything was gone. One morning he saw Isabeau at the fountain, her head bowed. He did not speak. Instead, he returned to his home and retrieved an apple from his last crate of stored harvest. He washed it in rainwater and left it on the fountain's edge. When he returned the next day, the apple was gone, and in its place was a bundle of lavender. From then on, they exchanged small gifts, an egg, a wildflower, a spoon carved from yew. No words passed between them, but each came to understand that the other was real, was alive, was still here. And in that quiet pact, something like healing began. Elsewhere, in the German city of Erfurt, the bells rang once again, not in mourning, but in cautious hope. The plague had passed for now, and the council, what remained of it, had declared a day of thanksgiving. A procession was held, led by the bishop and the surviving priests, their vestments faded but clean. They walked through streets scrubbed with vinegar, beneath banners sewn anew by trembling hands. And behind them followed the townspeople, some in tears, others with empty gazes, many walking as though they did not know how to be in crowds anymore. Among them was a widow named Marta, who clutched a small wooden cross her husband had carved before he died. She had buried him herself in the churchyard, where wildflowers now grew unchecked. She walked in the procession because she had promised him she would go on. She did not sing the hymns, but she whispered his name with each step. In a bakery near the cathedral, the ovens burned again. A boy named Jacob, no more than 12, shaped loaves by memory, his hands dusted with flour. He had once been the apprentice of a proud old baker who had taught him that bread was sacred, that it fed not only the belly, but the soul. That baker had died in May, his body carried out wrapped in a sack of linen. Jacob had wept for days, then built a fire and began to bake. Now, when the townspeople passed, they paused at the smell of yeast and warmth. Some bought bread, others simply stood and inhaled, remembering life before. To many, the scent was a kind of resurrection. Far away, across the channel, the plague tore through the countryside of Wales with a ferocity that left villages in ruin. In the shadow of the Black Mountains, a shepherd named Iorwerth led what remained of his flock through the hills, calling them each by name. He had named them after family members, long since gone. His sister, his cousin, his father, each had a lamb now bearing their name. At night, he sat by the fire and recited poems in Welsh, the cadences echoing across the valley, heard only by the stars and his sheep. His words were old, older than the plague, older than kings. They spoke of rivers and stones, of love and sorrow, of the sky's great silence. He did not write them down. He sang them to the land so the land might remember. In all corners of the continent, people began to rise, though their limbs were heavy with grief. In Bruges, a weaver rethreaded his loom. In Barcelona, a mother taught her daughter to knead dough. In Prague, an old scribe copied verses with trembling fingers, whispering blessings between each line. The Black Death had not vanished. In many places, it still crept from house to house, feeding on breath and blood. But in other places, it had begun to recede. And in its absence, life, scarred, quieter, humbler, began to take root once more. They were not yet healed. The land was not yet whole, but something tender had returned. The courage to open a door, to share a loaf, to speak a name. And in that there was hope. Not the triumphant kind that shouted from rooftops, but the gentle, persistent kind, like grass pushing through stone. By the first rains of autumn in 1349, the air over Europe had changed. It no longer bore only the scent of ash, lime, and decay, but now mingled with something softer. Tilled earth, baked bread, crushed grapes, and wood smoke curling once more from hearths. It was a quiet return, tentative and slow, but it marked a subtle shift. The plague had not yet vanished, but it had relented in many places, like a wolf having gorged and slunk into the woods. What remained was not peace, but aftermath, a land reshaped by loss. In the rolling hills of Lombardy, vineyards that had been left to wildness now yielded fruit in chaotic abundance. Their owners gone, the vines spilled over paths and walls, purple with clusters of forgotten harvest. In one such abandoned estate, a former servant named Juliana had taken shelter, living in the old winehouse with 2 goats and a blind dog she had found on the road. She did not mourn in the way others did. Grief had struck her long before the plague came, when her child was taken by fever years earlier. The pestilence, when it arrived, had simply finished the work of loneliness. And yet Juliana remained. She walked the rows of tangled vines each morning, pressing grapes between her fingers, tasting sweetness and rot. In the evenings, she built small fires beneath the olive trees and sang lullabies to the wind. The songs were not for the dead, they were for the trees, for the soil, for herself. She did not know if anyone could hear, but she sang anyway. In doing so, she remembered what it meant to feel alive. Southward, in the kingdom of Aragon, autumn was marked by the return of a sound that had been absent for months: laughter. In the mountain town of Teruel, where the plague had struck hard but passed quickly, the townspeople had begun to gather once more in the plaza. The gatherings were cautious, their voices hushed as if afraid to disturb some slumbering force. But the instinct to connect was irrepressible. An old taverner named Rodrigo began to reopen his doors, setting out simple benches and bowls of lentils for any who came. He did not charge coin. Instead, he accepted stories. Each visitor who sat at his table was asked to share something: a memory, a dream, a joke. In this way, Rodrigo began to rebuild not a business, but a community. There, beneath flickering lanterns, men and women shared tales of their losses and their survival. One man told of how he lived 2 weeks with a family of cats in an empty church. A woman recalled climbing into a convent bell tower and staying there through the summer, ringing the bell for no one. The stories were strange, sorrowful, and sometimes absurd, but in the telling, laughter returned. Tentative at first, then bold. And with it came a kind of healing that no prayer or salve could offer. Northward, in a rural monastery outside Cologne, Brother Matthias had taken to tending the scriptorium once more. The plague had claimed nearly all the brethren, and for weeks he had been the sole living soul within the abbey's stone walls. At first, he wandered the cloisters in silence, listening for voices that would never return. He prayed, and when prayer no longer gave him comfort, he worked. Now, he spent each day illuminating the margins of old texts with delicate vines and gold-leaf birds. He did not do this for God, but for beauty itself, for the idea that something could be crafted even in the ruins of despair. His fingers, once stiff with cold and grief, had regained their precision. And with each flourish of ink and color, he brought something back to life. Not the monks, not the past, but the idea that the world could be made whole in fragments. Sometimes he sang as he worked, old hymns with no harmony, no choir, only a single voice rising in the hollow of the chapel. He knew no one would read these pages for a long time, perhaps never. But the act of creating was enough. It meant that he had not surrendered. In Ireland, where the plague had struck later than on the continent, its shadow still lingered. The winds off the Atlantic carried the scent of brine and sorrow. Along the coast near Galway, a woman named Mariad kept a light burning in her window every night. She had done so since midsummer, after her son vanished, either to sickness or flight, she did not know. The candle flame, protected behind a pane of cow horn, flickered steadily as the dark pressed in. Mariad had become a symbol to those nearby. Fishermen spoke of her as the widow of the light, and some began to leave offerings at her gate, a fish wrapped in seaweed, a sprig of heather, a stone etched with prayers. She never asked for these gifts, never acknowledged them openly. But each morning she gathered them and laid them on a linen cloth near the fire. In this silent ritual, a bond was formed between herself and those who still passed by, unseen. And further east, in the low country marshes near Ghent, a group of orphaned children lived together in a ruined windmill. Their leader, if one could call her that, was a girl of no more than 15 named Lot. She had once worked as a weaver's assistant, threading looms with nimble fingers. Now she led a ragged band of younger survivors, 7 in all, through the routines of day and night. They had made the mill their home, patching its broken shutters with bits of cloth and salvaged wood. They slept in nests of straw and wool, told stories by firelight, and shared what food they could scavenge. Each morning, Lot taught them letters, drawing in ash on stones. Each evening they knelt in a circle and gave thanks, not in the language of any church, but in their own words. We are still here. We are together. Let us remember. No bells rang in the mill. No cross hung on the wall. But the place was sacred in its own way, a refuge shaped by children who refused to be forgotten, who would not let the world return to silence. By the end of that autumn, the first frost kissed the earth, silvery and soft. Leaves fell in slow spirals, blanketing the ground in gold and brown. The land, though weary, was not dead, and neither were its people. The Black Death had stolen much, but it had not extinguished the human will to sing, to speak, to gather, to create. In this quiet return of song, of ink, of firelight, of laughter, Europe took its first steps not only out of plague, but into remembrance. The world would never be as it was, but it would go on. In the pale hush of dawn, the little hamlet of Eldergrove lay wrapped in a veil of fine mist, its cottages huddled like whispers beside the old cobbled road. The air was still, heavy with the perfume of damp earth and distant wood smoke. It was a morning much like the ones that had come before it, but to those who remained, it felt unlike any other. For Eldergrove, once lively with the songs of milkmaids and the laughter of children, now stood caught in the grip of something far more silent than death itself, the aftermath. Sarah, the widow of the thatcher, emerged from her cottage with a shawl draped about her shoulders, her movements slow, deliberate. Her eyes, rimmed with red from sleepless nights, searched the horizon not for signs of the living, but for the absence of the dying. She was among the few who remained untouched by the pestilence, though the lines of strain about her brow told stories that words could not. Her days were now measured not by the rising and setting sun, but by the tolling of the bell from the chapel's lonely spire, a grim metronome marking each new loss. The village priest, Father Aldrich, had taken to walking the lanes in solitude, murmuring prayers to the Virgin in a voice so quiet that even the birds ceased their morning songs to listen. His once thriving flock had dwindled to a smattering of the old, the maimed, and the luckless. Each evening, as twilight unfurled its long blue veil, he would light a taper and place it by the door of every cottage he passed, a flickering sign that someone still breathed within. But what truly haunted Eldergrove was not merely the deaths, but the way of the dying. It had begun, as with many places, with a merchant, a stranger, his horse drawn weary by the road, his cart stacked with wares from the south. He had lingered only a night, bartering bolts of fabric and flasks of rare oil. But by dawn, he had vanished, leaving behind not coin or kin, but a sickness that bloomed unseen. It touched the baker's wife first, lovely Mela, who had once danced barefoot under moonlight with flowers in her hair. Within a day, her skin had darkened in terrible patches, her fever relentless. Within 2, she lay cold beneath a shroud, her lips stained as if with wine. Fear had crept in quietly, a shadow at the edge of each hearth. Doors were bolted, prayers offered, herbs hung in bundles above lintels. Yet none of it mattered, for the pestilence paid no heed to charms or charity. It crept beneath the door, clung to the breath of strangers, settled in the marrow like a curse from some forgotten god. And still the living endured. They buried their dead with gloved hands and downcast eyes, unable to summon the rites they had known. No choir sang the psalms. No mourner kissed the brow. Each burial was a rushed affair, the grave dug shallow, the soil piled quick. Father Aldrich did what he could, but even his voice faltered when the dead outnumbered the days. What bewildered them most, perhaps, was the sheer cruelty of it all. The plague was not content to kill. It stripped away dignity, unraveling the humanity of its victims. It turned skin to ash, breath to foam, limbs to trembling ruin. It took the young before the old, the innocent before the wicked. It did not discriminate. Sarah remembered her son's voice, bright as birdsong, calling her from the meadows just a fortnight past. Now his room remained sealed, his little wooden toys left untouched. Each night she stood before the door, hand raised as though to knock, but she never dared. She feared not the sickness, but the memory. In town, rumors brewed like storm clouds. They said the pestilence had been brought by the breath of demons, unleashed from the east by a sultan's curse. Others blamed the Jews, the lepers, the beggars who wandered with wide eyes and open sores. Few questioned the hand of God. His wrath, they thought, must surely have been roused. Yet even in their terror, a curious quietude had taken root. With so many gone, the clamor of daily life faded. There were no carts upon the roads, no clatter in the blacksmith's forge. The fields lay fallow, wildflowers blooming unchecked between rows of wheat that would never be harvested. And in that stillness, something changed. People began to see differently. The lady of the manor, once aloof in her silken rings, now walked barefoot among the hovels, handing broth to the feeble. A former thief took to watching over the children who remained, fashioning dolls from scraps to ward off their cries. And Father Aldrich, whose sermons had once been full of fire and righteousness, now spoke only of mercy, mercy for the sick, for the grieving, and for themselves. Still, the plague lingered. One morning, a strange cart appeared at the village edge. No horse pulled it, and no driver could be seen. Upon its platform lay a great wooden box, nailed shut, with iron seals and strange markings burned into its surface. Some said it was a gift from the bishopric, aid for the suffering. Others whispered of darker things, relics, curses, offerings to appease whatever god might have ears. The villagers debated its presence in hushed tones, none daring to approach. Even Sarah, bold as she was, kept her distance. That night, a storm rolled over the moors, and the cart was gone by dawn, leaving behind only churned mud and a strange acrid scent that lingered in the air like burnt rosemary. Time faltered. Days became indistinguishable from nights. Calendars ceased to matter, seasons blurred. But somehow, in spite of the sorrow, life continued its stubborn rhythm. A baby was born in a hidden loft to a girl no older than 15. The child did not cry but blinked up at the candlelight with eyes wide and unafraid. A sign, some whispered. A new beginning. And so, as the mists lifted once more from Elder Grove and the birds dared a timid song, the survivors emerged from the cradle of their grief. Not whole, never whole, but still breathing, still walking, still hoping. They did not know if the plague was truly gone or merely slumbering. But they had learned something more vital than any cure, how to endure, and how, even in the deepest silence of despair, the heart might find its voice again. Beyond Elder Grove's hedgerows, where the moors began their endless whispering stretch beneath the skies, another village stirred in the haze of morning. It was called Brindlehurst, nestled in the cleft of two hills like an old shepherd's forgotten pouch. The roofs, once thatched with care, were now patched in places with sod and cloth. A dozen chimneys exhaled weary smoke, rising into the gray with a listless sigh. What marked Brindlehurst, however, was not its charm nor its misfortune. It was its silence. The sort of silence that settled deep, not from peace, but from something broken that could not yet mend. The Black Death had passed through this place like a scythe through summer wheat, leaving few standing in its wake. Yet those who remained did not speak of it, at least not openly. It was as if the words themselves might draw the sickness back from whatever hellish corner it had fled to. Among the survivors was old Tom, a man who had once sung loudly at midsummer feasts and carved toys for every child born within a day's ride. His hands, now knotted with age and sorrow, still held the shape of joy in their weathered lines. Tom had buried his wife and 3 grandsons himself, not with grief loud upon his lips, but with a kind of tender reverence, each handful of soil falling like a prayer. He lived alone now at the edge of the village, in a cottage that creaked with the weight of memory. Each evening, he lit 2 candles in his window, one for the past and one for what might still come. It was his way of speaking to the world, of saying he had not yet surrendered. Brindlehurst, like many hamlets spared partial ruin, became a place of quiet rituals. Each week, the villagers gathered not in the church, its doors had been nailed shut since the priest fell ill, but beneath the old yew tree beside the stream. There, they would sit in a circle, never speaking unless it was of the crops or the weather. Sometimes they sang, though never in unison, and always in minor tones. It was during one such gathering that the stranger arrived. She came not from the road, but from the hills themselves, her figure emerging through the fog as if drawn from the marrow of the land. Clad in dark wool, her face veiled, she carried with her a bundle tied in red cloth. She did not ask to join them, but sat upon the edge of the circle with the ease of one returning to a place long left behind. The villagers said nothing. They had learned that silence was often kinder than suspicion, and so she remained, night after night, sometimes humming songs none could place, other times simply watching the flicker of their fire with eyes that saw too much. It was the baker's daughter, Lena, who first approached her. Young, though not untouched by sorrow, she had lost her twin brother in the early days of the sickness. Lena, bold as she was gentle, knelt beside the woman one evening and asked her name. The stranger did not give it. Instead, she offered the bundle she carried, unwrapping it slowly to reveal a single book, old, bound in leather so worn the title had vanished. Inside were pages filled not with words, but with drawings, images of plants, roots, bones, and stars, a ledger of forgotten wisdom. "This was my mother's," the woman said, her voice like distant rain. And her mothers before her, they knew how to listen, to the land, to the body, to the things others have chosen to fear. Lena, entranced, asked if the woman might teach her, and so it began. Whispers spread, as they always do, that the stranger was a healer, a witch, a heretic, that she could cure fevers with a tea of thistle and yarrow, that she had seen the plague and turned it away with a circle of salt and prayer, that she knew when the rats would return by watching the way the crows flew. But the woman, whose name remained unspoken, asked nothing in return. She did not promise miracles. She simply showed them how to notice, how to steep mullein for the chest, how to read the soil by the color of its worms, how to braid lavender for the mind. She taught them to watch the skies not for omens, but for seasons, to remember that sickness was not just the body undone, but the spirit unmoored. And Brindlehurst in its stillness began to shift. The children, once mute with fear, laughed again, though softly. The fields, long neglected, were tilled by hands no longer paralyzed with dread. The people began to write down their own recipes, their own prayers, not the ones taught from pulpits, but the ones born from the heart's quiet ache. Still, the shadows had not entirely lifted. One night, a child fell ill, fever, shivering, black boils blooming along her neck. The old terror returned like a scream in the blood. The villagers stood at her door, torn between flight and faith. Lena rushed to the stranger, tears streaking her soot-smudged cheeks. The woman came. She entered the cottage and closed the door behind her. No one knows what passed within. Some claimed they saw smoke of deep blue rise from the chimney. Others said they heard singing, not in the tongue of men, but of earth and flame. When dawn came, the door opened, and the child slept peacefully, the fever gone, the boils faded. The villagers could not explain it, and so they did not try. From that day, the woman became known only as the Morning Star, a name that meant nothing and everything. She remained at the edge of Brindlehurst, her presence neither welcome nor unwelcome, like the moon in its quiet watching. But what she left behind was more than healing. She left a way, a rhythm, a means of being that did not deny sorrow, but carried it gently in both hands, like a bowl of water from a sacred spring. And in that, perhaps, was her greatest gift. For long after she vanished, as mysteriously as she had come, Brindlehurst remembered, not her face, nor her voice, but the feeling she had stirred, that even in the face of the cruelest affliction, the earth still breathed. The body still held secrets, and the soul, though bruised, might yet rise like mist from the valley, returning again and again to greet the light. The road to the village of Hallicross wound like a tired ribbon through fields choked by overgrowth. And it was upon this road that a man named Corwin traveled with little more than a satchel of dried bread and a thin, patched cloak. He had been walking for 3 days, his boots near worn through, his cheeks wind-burnt and hollow. Like so many others who wandered the wasted countryside, Corwin had no destination, only the desire to escape memory. And perhaps, if fortune was kind, find a place untouched. Hallicross was not untouched. It wore its grief openly, like an old wound that refused to close. The gates, once watched by sentries in boiled leather, hung open. No one guarded the lanes. No dogs barked. The only sound was the caw of a raven circling the steeple of the chapel, its wings casting long, slow-moving shadows. Corwin stepped through the village arch with a weariness that felt ancient. He passed broken carts, doors left ajar, and a child's doll resting oddly in the middle of the path, its button eyes staring skyward. In another time, such sights might have roused sorrow or fear. But sorrow had become as common as breath, and fear, dull and constant, no longer startled. It was at the well that he met the first soul. An old man wrapped in a mantle of faded blue sat beneath the well's eave, a jug of water resting between his legs. He looked up with pale, watery eyes and nodded. "Another one passing through?" he asked, his voice neither welcoming nor wary. Corwin nodded. "I heard there were still people here." "A few," the man said, taking a sip. "Most left, most who stayed. Well, they don't talk much anymore." They sat in silence for a time, broken only by the creak of the wind through brittle shutters. Then the old man pointed to the chapel at the hill's edge. "She lives up there," he said, "the one who stays." Corwin furrowed his brow. "She, a nun, of sorts, came long after the sickness first struck. They say she was from one of the northern abbeys, the ones that burned when the fever took the sisters. Now she keeps the bells. And she prays." "For the dead?" "For the living," the man replied, and then said no more. Corwin, guided by something quieter than reason, made his way to the chapel. The door stood ajar, weather-beaten and cracked, revealing a hall stripped bare of its former finery. The pews were few and scattered. The altar held no chalice, only a bowl of lavender and a bundle of rosemary bound in red twine. The nun was there. She knelt before the stained glass window, though the glass had long since shattered, leaving only jagged remnants of saints and halos. She wore the simple robe of a Benedictine, though her wimple was black and unadorned, her hands rough with labor. Corwin did not speak. He merely watched. After a time, she turned. "You've walked far," she said, not unkindly. "I've walked from what I cannot forget." She nodded as if she understood. "And what do you seek?" He hesitated. "Silence, shelter, something that doesn't run red with memory." She stood slowly, like one carrying invisible burdens, and gestured to the side door. "You may sleep in the sacristy. There is bread and a bit of cider. You will not be asked to pray, only to respect the quiet." Corwin bowed his head. "That I can do." In the days that followed, he remained. At first, simply to rest. But rest gave way to observation. The nun, whose name was never given, maintained a quiet rhythm. At dawn, she rang the chapel bell, not with force, but with a soft, measured cadence. She tended the herbs behind the vestry, wrote in a ledger with steady hand, and walked each lane of Hallicross every evening, placing a sprig of thyme at each doorstep. When asked why, she only said, "The village may be hollow, but memory lives here still. I mark what was loved." There were others, too, who drifted into Hallicross. A mother and her ailing daughter. A mason who had lost his tools but not his skill. A boy of no more than 12 who spoke only with his eyes. Each was taken in. No questions, no terms. Just a quiet expectation to join in the tending of what remained. It was during one cold dusk that a child died. The girl, already sick upon arrival, had grown weaker. The nun watched over her, preparing infusions, reading from the psalter in low tones. But when the child passed, she did not weep. She merely held the mother, and together they sat in the chapel until the stars arrived. Corwin helped dig the grave. They buried the girl beneath the lilac tree, the first to be laid there in years. The soil was frozen, resisting, but the act itself became a form of communion, a binding between the living and the gone. Afterward, the nun placed a single white feather on the grave. When Corwin asked what it meant, she replied, "A symbol, not of angels, but of breath, of all that passes and lingers." Time lost shape in Hallicross. Seasons moved. Spring softened the trees, and with it came flowers from forgotten seeds. The villagers, if they could still be called that, rebuilt little by little, not to restore what was, but to honor what remained. A table was carved anew. A wall was painted with the names of the lost, not as a roll of mourning, but as a constellation, a sky of memory. Corwin stayed. He learned to thatch, to mix teas from mint and valerian, to mend pages in the nun's great ledger. At night, he dreamed less of ashen screams and more of bells tolling over green hills. One evening, while watching the sun sink behind the chapel's eaves, he asked her if she had ever been afraid. She looked out over the village, her face unreadable. Of death? She asked. No. Of forgetting? Always. And in that reply was all the world. For in Hallicross, amid the ruin, a new kind of life was stirring, one not built on the denial of the plague, but on the quiet acceptance of what it had left behind. A life rooted in remembrance, in ritual, in the breath between sorrow and peace. And somewhere in the fields, among the humming bees and rustling wheat, a future slowly, gently unfolded. Far beyond Hallicross, where the river split like veins through the wild country of Old Eastmarch, there stood the remnants of a forgotten stronghold, Ser Glaron, the fortress of the shining mist. Long before the pestilence had ever been spoken of in hush or hymn, the fortress had been a place of learning and counsel. Scribes, monks, and healers once gathered beneath its vaulted arches, recording the stars, deciphering dreams, and studying the humors of the body with such fervor that even the great abbeys of the realm sent their novices to apprentice there. But by the time the Black Death came upon the land like a shroud, Caer Glaron was little more than a memory etched into ivy-covered stone. The plague had arrived not with travelers or traders, but with the wind itself, so the old folk said. It slipped through the fortress walls like a ghost, and before the monks could burn their incense or chant their salves, the halls had fallen quiet. Yet not all within had perished. One soul remained. Her name was Elise of Crowsmere, though no one now called her by it. In the chronicles kept by those who still wandered the countryside, she was known only as the archivist. It was said she wore robes darker than pitch, and that she never left the walls of Caer Glaron. Not for bread, not for comfort, not even for news of the world beyond. She was the last guardian of the fortress's great library. Within those crumbling chambers lay volumes no longer found in the churches or courts. Ancient scrolls on healing with rosehip and foxglove, codices of astrological alignments and their meanings, drawings of plague boils compared to bee stings and arrow wounds. Elise, once a novice herself under the order of St. Berengar, had vowed to remain when others fled. If knowledge is lost, she had said to the fleeing brethren, then so too are we. The others had begged her to leave. She refused. And so she stayed. Each morning she swept the dust from the stone floors, brewed tea from the herbs in the overgrown cloister, and lit a candle for every name etched into the walls, names of scribes, students, pilgrims who had passed through and never left. Her only companion was a crow, sleek and solemn, who had taken to roosting atop the apse window. She called him Corvin, and though he did not speak, he followed her from chamber to chamber, as though guarding her vigil. He had been there since the first autumn of the plague, and never once had he left. It was during the 3rd year of the pestilence that a knock came at the gate. Not a thunderous bang nor a desperate pounding, but a single deliberate tap. Elise, whose ears had grown attuned to silence as to scripture, heard it as clearly as thunder. She made her way to the outer hall, her lamp casting long shadows across faded mosaics, and opened the heavy door. There stood a boy, thin, pale, no older than 14. His clothes were worn to threads and his eyes hollow with travel. Yet he stood straight, one hand clutched tightly around a bundle wrapped in linen. "I was told to find the archivist," he said, voice barely above the wind. "You found her," Elise replied gently. Without another word, he stepped forward, and she, without question, let him in. His name was Iwan, and he had come from a coastal monastery far to the south, where the plague had ravaged both monks and manuscripts alike. Before his master succumbed, he had entrusted Iwan with a single scroll, a parchment said to contain a diagram of the pestilence's pattern, marked by lunar cycles and the rising of northern winds. The scroll, nearly lost in a river crossing and half burned from a lightning strike, was now crumpled but intact. Elise took it with reverence. Together, over the course of the cold months, they pored over its contents. The diagram was crude, sketched in haste, but it spoke of clusters, villages struck in spirals, not lines. It hinted that the pestilence did not move like a march of soldiers, but like a wildfire, leaping across unseen ridges, carried by breath and breeze, aided by the habits of men. Elise began to write. By night, candle flickering, she copied and cross-referenced every page she could find that spoke of sickness, the plague of Justinian, the fever tides of Galamore, the coughs that had once struck down the nomads of the north. And from these writings, she began to build a tapestry, one not of hope or cure, but of understanding. Iwan became her assistant, his eyes now brighter, his frame fuller from the warm stews she prepared from root and grain. He cataloged, indexed, mended the broken bindings with linen strips soaked in vinegar. Under Alyssa's guidance, he learned not only to preserve, but to interpret. In time, they discovered a pattern. Where salt water mingled with sweet, estuaries, marshes, river mouths, the sickness spread faster. Where wind came often from the east, it came earlier. In places where livestock were slaughtered openly in town centers, the deaths climbed steeply. None of these were certainties, but they were threads. Threads no one else had seen or had survived long enough to follow. And still, no one came to Caer Glaeron. The world beyond had forgotten the fortress, just as it had forgotten many things. But Elise, with ink-stained hands and eyes lined with quiet determination, had not forgotten. She had remembered everything. And in doing so, she had preserved a lifeline for those who might one day rebuild. When spring returned once more, the valley below burst into bloom. Wildflowers choked the roadways, and the bees returned in golden hums. Iwan stood atop the parapets one morning, looking out over the mist-cloaked hills. "Do you think the sickness will return?" he asked. Elise did not answer at once. She placed a quill back into its jar, looked toward the north where smoke still sometimes rose from distant villages, and finally said, "If it does, we'll be ready." For that was the quiet truth they had uncovered. Not a cure, not a salvation, but a wisdom born of patient watching. The plague had taken many things, but it had not taken their will to witness, to endure, to remember. And in a world where forgetting had become its own kind of death, the act of remembrance was perhaps the first breath of healing. In the western reaches of the kingdom, where the cliffs met the sea in jagged cries of stone and spray, there lay a coastal town called Fenwatch. Once a bustling port of salted fish, cured hides, and wind-battered sails, Fenwatch had grown hushed, like a bell muffled beneath snow. The docks, which had echoed with the songs of sailors and the creak of wooden masts, now groaned only when the tide rose too high. It was here that the pestilence had arrived by ship. The vessel, whose name no one remembered now, had appeared at dawn one autumn morning, shrouded in fog, its sails limp, its deck still. No answer came when the harbor master hailed her. The townsfolk watched as she drifted closer, her hull scraping against the wharf like a whisper of warning. Then the bodies were found. Sailors sprawled across the deck, some clasping their throats, others bound in fevered poses of prayer or agony. Black boils marked their necks, their chests, their groins. Rats poured from the hold, fleeing like demons loosed from some unholy tomb. The harbor master ordered the vessel burned by nightfall. The flames reached high into the black sky, casting twisted shadows along the stone streets of Fenwatch. The townspeople, gathered in silent awe, did not cheer. They merely watched, knowing in their bones that the fire had come too late. Within a fortnight, the sickness bloomed. It began with the fishmonger's apprentice, a boy named Lou. He fell ill one morning after scaling a haddock caught near the wreckage site. Then the cooper's eldest daughter. Then 2 monks from the Tide Priory who had gone to bless the shore. It moved quickly, like a storm tide that surged before one could retreat, and Fenwatch, proud and stubborn, was swallowed. But not all turned to despair. There lived in Fenwatch a woman named Brida, a widow of the sea. Her husband had drowned a decade prior, pulled beneath the brine during a winter storm. Since then, Brida had lived simply, mending nets, tending to her small garden, and speaking little to those who passed. Yet there was a steadiness in her presence, a resilience born not from defiance, but from deep-rooted acceptance of sorrow. When the sickness came, Brida did not flee. She remained in her cottage on the cliff's edge, watching the smoke rise from burning homes, hearing the toll of the church bell grow frantic, then cease altogether. One by one, her neighbors vanished into silence. Then the girl arrived. She appeared at Brida's doorstep during a night of wild wind, barefoot, wrapped in a woolen shawl too thin for the season. Her cheeks were hollow, her eyes wide and storm-colored. She said nothing, only looked up as if she had known somehow that this door would open. Brida let her in. She learned the girl's name was Mare, that she had come from a fishing hamlet further along the coast, now emptied by fever and flame. Her family gone, she had walked for days along the cliffs, drawn by some unspoken thread to Fenwatch. Brida said nothing of fate or spirits. She simply fed the child broth and let her sleep. In the days that followed, the two formed a quiet rhythm. Brida taught Mare how to grind herbs into poultices, how to hang seaweed to dry for salves, how to listen to the gulls for signs of changing weather. At dusk, they would walk to the edge of the cliffs and watch the sea heave against the rocks, sometimes in silence, other times with Brida telling stories. Old tales of sea spirits, of fisher kings and lost islands that emerged only in moonlight. But more than stories, Brida offered steadiness. And in Mare, Brida found something she had not felt since before the sickness: hope. Not the foolish kind, bright and fleeting like candlelight, but the enduring sort that grows slow and deep, like roots beneath frost. When others came, those few who had survived inland and heard of a woman who still tended herbs by the sea, they found not a healer, but a hearth. Brida took them in without judgment. Some stayed for only a night, others remained. Soon, Fenwatch was not a town, but a sanctuary. Brida taught them what she knew: how to boil kelp for salves, how to read the weather by the salt on one's skin, how to cleanse wounds with brine and barley ash. But more than that, she showed them how to endure grief without being consumed by it. The chapel, long abandoned, was reopened, not as a house of worship, but as a place of rest. Cots were laid, herbs hung from the beams, and each window was left unshuttered to let the sea breeze move freely. Here the sick were brought not to die, but to be witnessed. There were deaths still. No hand could stay the plague in every case. But those who passed did so beneath lullabies sung by strangers who had become kin, with hands clasped and breath shared until the last. No one died alone, and the sea, vast and unchanging, became their measure of time. Each morning, Brida walked the shore, collecting driftwood, casting prayers in the form of small shells placed upon the tide line. She never asked for protection, only peace, only remembrance. Years passed. The sickness receded like a tide that had taken too much with it. But in Fenwatch, the scars were not hidden. Names were carved into the driftwood fence near the chapel, a growing row of memory. Stories were told often, of those lost, of those found, of nights when the wind howled so loud it seemed the sea itself wept. Mare grew. She took Brida's place when the widow's legs no longer allowed her down to the shore. She sang the same songs, brewed the same teas. Her voice, once timid, grew strong with the rhythm of waves and memory. Brida passed in spring. She was buried on the cliff's edge, her grave marked by a stone shaped like a wave. No priest intoned rites. Only Mare, who placed a net of woven herbs at the foot and whispered, "You are sea and salt and storm, and we are made better for having known your tide." And so Fenwatch remained, not healed, not whole, but alive. A place where the sea still wept, where gulls still cried, and where the silence of grief had been shaped into something enduring, something sacred, something human. In the far northern reaches of the realm, where the land yielded not to fields or pasture but to heather, stone, and wind, there stood the highland village of Kelwyn. Perched atop a narrow plateau and cradled by craggy hills, Selwyn was a place long known for its solitude. The winters came early, stayed long, and left reluctantly. Snow cloaked the cottages well into spring, and the stars at night blinked like cold, patient gods. Kelwyn had once been a village of shepherds and herdsmen, hardy souls who counted the days not by feast or fast, but by the cycles of their flocks and the taste of the wind. They were people of few words, steeped in old customs and older silences. Their chapel bore no glass, only rough stone and a single bell. Their songs were not written down, but passed from throat to throat, like smoke rising from a peat fire. When the pestilence came to Selwyn, it arrived as all things did in that land, quietly, through the back door. No merchant brought it, no caravan nor sailor. It came on the breath of the wind, or perhaps in the bones of a raven that fell still in the churchyard. The first to fall was old Enna, the midwife, whose hands had delivered every child in Tailwind for 2 generations. Then the stonemason. Then the twins who watched the goats beyond the southern ridge. The village did not cry out. It did not send for help. Calwyn endured in the only way it knew how, with silence and ritual. The villagers sealed their homes not with iron or wood, but with bundles of rowan and sheep's wool hung from the lintel in threes. They carried amulets carved from mountain ash. They sang the lullabies of their mothers over bowls of boiling heather, letting the steam rise and anoint their faces. They did not pray to saints or relics, but to the land itself, to the hills and the skies and the deep, old stones. Among them was a woman named Ailys, the daughter of a shepherd and a weaver of some renown. Ailys had never left Calwyn. She had never seen the great abbeys of the south or the markets of the lowlands. Her world was made of hill and snow and wool, and she knew the names of every bend in the brook and every hollow in the earth. She had a gift, it was said, an eye for omens, a hand that soothed animals and men alike. The village called her stone-born, not as insult, but as honor. When the plague began its slow sweep through Sailwind, Ailys did not run. She walked each lane in the twilight hours, barefoot upon the frost-bitten grass, scattering salt and whispering words older than the book. The chapel, long unused but never unloved, became her refuge. There, she lit candles in the hollows of the stone walls and painted circles of ash upon the flagstones. She mixed tinctures from pine and moss, burned dried juniper on the altar, and sang as her grandmother had once sung, songs with no known language, only rhythm and breath. And though the sickness did not spare the village, it slowed. It moved with less fury, less abandon. Some still perished. Ailys wept quietly for them, lighting a taper for each, but many recovered. Those who did spoke of strange dreams in which Ailys appeared, guiding them along snowy paths or holding bowls of glowing fire. Whether dream or fever fantasy, they all said the same: she showed me the way. One night, as the frost turned the world to silver, a stranger arrived. A man, hooded and pale, his voice hoarse from wind and travel. He collapsed just beyond the village gate, and it was Ailys who found him. She carried him, not with ease but with resolve, to the chapel, where she laid him beneath woolen blankets and fed him a tea brewed with roots and smoke. He bore signs of the pestilence, trembling limbs, fevered breath, the telltale swell of a darkened gland. But Ailys did not flinch. She sat by him night and day, humming softly, dabbing his brow, and marking the phases of the moon beside his cot. He survived. When he could speak, he told her his name was Eden, that he had come from a southern abbey where all had fallen but him. He had fled north, guided not by map or road, but by a name he had heard whispered in his dreams: Calwyn. Ailys did not question it. She had long believed that the world had veins of meaning running through it, invisible but firm, and that sometimes the lost could follow those veins to sanctuary. Eden remained. Not as a priest, his faith had been shaken by too many burials, but as a helper, a listener. He learned the old ways from Ailys, gathering herbs, reading the clouds, listening to the cries of night birds. He carved charms of rowan and taught the children letters by drawing in the snow. And Chalwyn began to breathe again. The sheep returned to the hills. The old songs were sung not in mourning, but in harvest. The bell, silent for so long, tolled once more, low and slow to mark the coming of light. Ailys never claimed credit. She said only that the land had decided to show mercy, and that it had asked for nothing in return but remembrance. On the solstice, a great fire was lit atop the northern ridge, as had once been done in the time of her ancestors. The whole village gathered, standing in silence as the flames reached skyward. Eden stood beside Ailys, and in that moment, it was as though the old and the new, the sacred and the sorrowful, had found one another again. No grand monuments were raised in Sailwind. No parchment recorded the names of the saved. But among the heather and stone, among the curling mist and the ever-turning sky, there lived a quiet truth, that even in the coldest places, where sorrow lies thick upon the ground, warmth may yet be kindled by steady hands, old songs, and hearts that do not turn away. Far from the highland hush of Caelwyn, beyond the forests where pine and birch wrestled with the wind, lay the once thriving market town of Dunlow. It was a place marked by crossroads, roads that brought traders from distant coasts, pilgrims on holy journeys, and tinkers whose wagons rattled with bright trinkets and whispered secrets. Dunlow's great square had known the clamor of laughter, the cry of hawkers, the ring of hammer on anvil. But when the Black Death arrived, it took the sound first. Stalls that once brimmed with spices and dyed cloth were abandoned, baskets overturned, coins left to tarnish in the mud. The townsfolk locked themselves behind heavy shutters, prayers pressed to their lips like last rites. Some fled into the forest's dark embrace, hoping to outrun the breath of the pestilence. Few returned. When the fever's worst fury passed, Dunlow was not empty, but it was hollowed. Its stone walls still stood, its gates still swung on their iron hinges, but the heart of it beat faintly, as though afraid to stir the air too much, lest the sickness remember them again. Yet within this silence rose a small defiance, born not from armor or blade, but from ink. There, in a dim shop wedged between the ruined apothecary and the old cooper's yard, lived Brother Matthias, a scribe who had once served at the great library of Allen Abbey before it too fell to the plague. Matthias was not young. His hair had silvered, and his eyes were lined with sleepless years. But his hands remained sure, steady in their devotion to words and parchment. He had come to Dunlow at the urging of his dying abbot, carrying with him a trunk of rescued manuscripts bound in cracked leather. The journey had cost him dearly. 2 novices lost to fever on the road, another to a highwayman's blade. By the time he reached the town's gates, he was alone but for his cargo of fragile knowledge. In Dunlow, he found refuge in what had once been a bookseller's shop, a narrow place with walls thick as castle stone, shelves still lined with volumes long untouched. Here, Matthias set about his task, to copy, to preserve, to stitch together the fraying threads of memory so that the plague's ruin would not claim thought as it had claimed flesh. By day, he wrote. By night, he lit a single lamp in the window, a quiet beacon to any soul who might pass by, searching not for healing of the body, but for solace of the mind. At first, none came. The townsfolk were wary, whispering that parchment could carry the sickness, that words might conjure demons. But word spread slowly, as it does where hope is scarce. One evening, in the cold hush before dawn, a girl appeared at his door. She was slight, no more than 15, her hair bound in a rag. She did not knock. She simply stood in the lamplight, eyes fixed on the volumes stacked like silent sentinels behind him. Matthias, peering through the wavering glow, beckoned her in without question. Her name was Alice. She had never learned to read, but she had come because her mother, now buried beyond the town wall, had spoken of books that could hold prayers strong enough to bind the plague away. Matthias did not promise miracles. Instead, he placed before her a single sheet of fresh parchment, a quill, and a pot of ink. "Write your mother's name," he said. She hesitated. Her fingers trembled around the quill, scratching letters slow and crooked. When she finished, the name gleamed wet in the lamplight, Merwin. "Now it is here," Matthias told her softly. "Safe. Remembered." And so she stayed. Each day, Alice returned, learning her letters under his patient hand. Soon, she helped him grind pigments for the illuminated borders, gold leaf pressed carefully along the edges like dawn breaking through dark clouds. Others came too, one by one at first. A merchant's widow, a stonemason's lame son, an old man who could not sleep unless he heard verses read aloud. They gathered not in crowds, but in small clusters, voices hushed yet alive. In the hush of Dunlow's Square, the scriptorium became a kind of sanctuary, neither church nor hospital, but a bridge between the dying past and the trembling future. Some brought scraps of lore, a grandmother's recipe for poultices of nettle and honey, a midwife's record of births and burials. Matthias copied it all, binding each scrap into a growing book he called The Memory of Dunlow. When pages were scarce, he reused parchment torn from ledgers of debts long irrelevant. When ink ran dry, he taught the children to boil gallnuts, to crush charcoal, to make something from the ruins of what had been. Yet not all welcomed this quiet defiance. A group of town elders, fearful and suspicious, came to the scriptorium one moonless night. They accused Matthias of hoarding knowledge that should be buried with the plague, lest it invite more ruin. They demanded the books be burned, the pages scattered to the river. Matthias did not raise his voice. He simply pointed to Alice, now asleep beside a stack of finished pages. If we burn this, he said, his voice low but steady, we burn her hope too. Perhaps it was the way the candlelight fell upon the girl's face, or perhaps the elders saw in the lined features of the old scribe a reflection of their own fear. They left without another word, their footsteps swallowed by the empty square. And so the lamp burned on. Winter came, harsh and biting. Snow drifted against the scriptorium door. Inside, Matthias worked by candle and breath-frosted window, Alice beside him, their hands ink-stained, their eyes raw with sleeplessness but shining with purpose. Long after the plague's last embers faded, the scriptorium remained. The memory of Dunlow grew thick with names, tales, small truths that might have vanished into the cold. When Matthias's own time came, quietly, at his desk, quill still in hand, it was Alice who took up the lamp. She opened the door wide each night, as he had taught her, a beacon for any who still feared forgetting more than death itself. And so, in that silent town where once only dread had walked the square, words endured, names endured, memory endured, fragile as parchment, resilient as hope. Beyond the edge of Dunlow's frost-bitten lanes, over miles of rolling fields left ragged by neglect, lay the monastery of St. Isambert, a modest cloister built of pale limestone, perched upon a low rise that once caught the dawn's first warmth. Long before the plague, St. Isambert's was a place of pilgrimage, known less for relics or miracles and more for its gardens. The brothers there tended orchards and herb beds with quiet devotion, sending cartloads of rosemary, sage, and lavender to villages near and far. In a land where famine often lingered just beyond the hedge, their gardens were a balm against hunger and hopelessness alike. When the Black Death came to St. Isambert's, it came not as a roar but as a sigh. One by one, the brothers fell. The corridors, once fragrant with drying herbs, turned musty with the scent of sickness. Psalms grew faint. The orchard gates swung open to wild deer that grazed unchecked among the pear trees. By winter's first frost, only 3 remained. Brother Ansel, eldest of them all, who knew every root and branch by name. Brother Gervas, a former soldier turned monk, whose voice still carried like a captain's cry. And Brother Rennet, the youngest, who had arrived but 2 winters before, with hands so soft the others had teased he'd never so much as pulled a turnip. They did not leave. They could not. Their vows bound them not only to God, but to the soil that had fed them and those they served. When it became clear that no help would come from the diocese, Ansel gathered what strength he had and spoke to the other 2 in the cloister's freezing refectory. "Too much has been taken from this earth," he said, voice brittle as old bark. "If we abandon these gardens now, they'll vanish to bramble and thorn, and those who live after us will find nothing but ruin." Gervais nodded. He was a man of few illusions. He knew they might not see another spring. But Renette, eyes wide with fear yet fierce with something more, placed his hand atop Ansel's. "Then let us keep it alive," he said, "as long as we breathe." So they began. By day, they tended the rows of herbs that clung stubbornly to life in the cold, yarrow, thyme, winter savory. They pruned dead branches from the orchard's oldest trees, careful not to disturb the robins nesting in the bare limbs. They carried bundles of cut lavender into the shuttered chapel, hanging them in great fragrant wreaths above the altar, where no choir now sang. At night, they slept little. They read from the Psalter by candlelight. They copied what recipes they could remember: tonics for coughs, poultices for sores, infusions to ease the terror in fevered dreams. Ansel's hands, once so deft, now trembled as he wrote, but Renette steadied them, guiding the quill when his elder's strength failed. Sometimes, travelers came, ragged, hollow-eyed folk who had heard whispers of St. Isambert's gardens still breathing when all else had withered. The brothers asked no coin. They shared what roots they could spare, pressing waxed packets of dried herbs into shaking palms, offering a cup of rosemary tea to warm bones grown thin with grief. One night, in the hush before dawn, a woman arrived carrying a child no bigger than a sack of grain. The boy's breath rattled in his chest, a sound too close to the last sigh that had filled the cloister halls too many times before. Rennet took them into the old infirmary, now stripped of beds but not of mercy. All through that bitter night, Rennet tended the boy with linen compresses steeped in thyme and sage, whispering soft prayers between the child's shallow breaths. Ansel watched from the doorway, his face half-shadowed, remembering every child he'd once blessed beneath these rafters, the laughter that once danced through the orchard rows. When dawn broke, pale and cold, the boy still breathed. It was not triumph, it was not cure, but it was something. Word spread in secret ways that St. Isenbert's had not fallen entirely to the black wind, that if one could walk far enough, if one could endure the snow and the fear, there was still a place where hands worked the soil, where green things defied the rot. As winter yielded, hesitant and slow, to a fragile spring, the monastery saw faces it had never known. Mothers clutching infants, old men with coughs that rattled like dry seed pods, children with bellies too lean to bear. Ansel, Gervas, and Rennet welcomed each with the same quiet grace. When Brother Ansel's last breath came, it came in the orchard, beneath a pear tree just shy of bloom. Gervais and Rennet found him seated on the cold earth, his hands resting in his lap, eyes closed, as though he listened for the first birdsong of the year. They buried him in the garden's heart, beneath a circle of rosemary. Rennet pressed seeds into the soil above him, mint, chive, sage, saying softly, "So you will feed us still." By the time summer's warmth curled sweetly through St. Isenbert's cloister, Rennet stood at the edge of the orchard with Gervais, who leaned now more heavily on his staff. Together, they watched children run laughing among the rows, mothers gathering handfuls of herbs with reverent hands. The plague had not vanished. It still smoldered in distant towns, still waited in shadows. But here, in this small walled garden where the earth was tended by worn but willing hands, something stubborn had survived. Roots clutched the soil, blossoms opened to sun, and prayers rose not as pleas but as promises. That life, once nourished, could take root again, even in the ruins. That the green would return in time to all who remembered to care for it, and that some places, small, hidden, steadfast, would always stand quietly defiant against the black tide. South of St. Isenbert's gardens, where the roads turned to rutted tracks winding through marshland and bracken, there lay the village of Mere Hollow, a place named not for any grandeur, but for its low, sodden fields that filled with mist each dawn. The hollow was a quiet place even before the pestilence, its people patient, their voices soft as the reeds that bent in the wind. They were fisherfolk and reed cutters, gatherers of watercress and frog spawn, makers of baskets fine enough to grace the tables of distant manors. When the Black Death found Mere Hollow, it came on feet soaked with mud. A peddler, it was said, limped into the village one dusk, shoulders hunched, face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. He traded trinkets for fish, accepted a cup of warm broth at the door of Widow Alwyn's cottage. By dawn, he was gone, his tracks lost in the swamp. But the sickness remained, drifting through the damp air, settling in the warmth of hearth and blanket. The first to fall were the basket weavers who worked in close quarters, fingers slick with willow sap and river water. Then the reed cutters, whose feet were always wet and skin always chilled. Mere Hollow, which had never known the hammering boots of soldiers nor the roar of great cities, found itself undone by a silence that deepened with each passing day. Yet amid this hush, one voice remained. Old Maud was her name, no surname needed, for all knew her. She had lived on the village's edge since she was a girl, in a squat stone cottage, half swallowed by brambles and mist. Some whispered she was a witch, for she spoke to owls and kept jars of strange roots hanging above her hearth. Others called her a healer, though she never claimed such a title. When the fever came, Maud did not close her door. She brewed teas of marshmallow root and mint, laid cool cloths on burning foreheads, and whispered songs in a language so old none alive could name its tongue. She demanded nothing for her tending, save that each who came leave behind a single reed, cut fresh from the hollow. With these reeds, Maud wove. Each night, by the sputtering glow of her fire, she shaped the green stalks into small talismans, knotted circles, tiny mats, plates that looked like runes from a forgotten book. She placed these at the thresholds of the sick, on windowsills, above cradles where the fever lingered. No one knew if the talismans cured or merely comforted, but in Mere Hollow, hope was as rare and precious as gold, so they trusted her weaving. When the worst of the sickness came, Maud took no sleep. She moved through the village, wrapped in her patchwork shawl, stepping over puddles that mirrored the moon. She spoke softly to those who waited by bedsides, pressing cups of willow bark brew into trembling hands. And when the dying time could not be turned, Maud stayed too. She sat with each soul, never flinching at the rasp of a final breath, never recoiling when the sores darkened the skin. She murmured lullabies as if they were children drifting off to sleep, and when the last sigh faded, she covered their faces with clean cloths, her old hands gentle and unhurried. In the heart of winter, when the hollow's ponds froze and the reeds stood stiff and rimed with frost, Maud fell ill herself. Fever found her as it had found so many, silent, insistent, unpitying. The village gathered outside her door, torches flickering in the mist. For all her secrets, all her stubborn tending, they could not summon the strength to save her. Instead, they brought reeds, bundles of green and gold, cut fresh from the marsh's icy edge. They laid them at her threshold in silent vigil. But Maud, it seemed, was not yet ready to surrender her weaving. On the seventh night, when the moon gleamed like a silver coin over the hollow, Maud rose from her bed. Thin as a reed herself, she made her way to the hearth where the last embers glowed. There, with hands shaking but certain, she wove one final charm, a great circle of reeds bound with a lock of her own gray hair. When it was done, she hung it above her cottage door. By morning, the fever had broken. She emerged at dawn, leaning on a driftwood staff, her breath visible in the chill air. Those gathered gasped as if seeing a ghost, but Maud only smiled her small, knowing smile. From that day forward, Mere Hollow changed. The villagers, once wary of the marsh's creeping mists, learned to see it as Maud did. Not a curse, but a cradle. They tended the reeds with care, cutting them only when the moon was right, weaving charms to hang above doors and boats alike. They shared Maud's teas, wrote her songs in the margins of their prayer books. And when they spoke of the plague in hushed tones, they did not speak only of death, but of the old woman who sat by the dying and brought the living back to breath. Years later, when Maud's own time came, quietly in her sleep, her hair spread like silver threads upon her pillow, they buried her not in the churchyard, but at the marsh's edge where the reeds whispered always. Each villager laid a single woven talisman upon her grave, until the mound gleamed with pale green and gold beneath the rising mist. And so, in Mere Hollow, where the sickness had once crept silent as fog, the reeds grew thick and tall, a living testament to what it means to stand watch over one another when the world turns cold. As dawn's first hush settled over the valley, a fragile hope clung to the few souls who had survived thus far. In the hush of mid-autumn, when the leaves turned brittle and fell like papery confessions onto the earth, those who remained behind castle walls or shuttered cottages found themselves in quiet rebellion against the silence that the pestilence demanded. They whispered to each other in the dimness, their voices trembling like candle flames caught in a draft. In a remote hamlet, far from the noble manors and the crowded market towns, a young woman named Leora sat by the dying embers of her hearth. Her mother and father lay still beneath woolen blankets, their breaths long gone to realms unseen. She had wrapped them herself, with trembling hands and a mind half broken by fatigue and dread. But now she sat awake through each night, fingers splayed upon her knees, listening to the wind whisper through the cracks in her cottage walls. Word had spread that the pestilence had begun to weaken in some parts, but the fear, like a ghost that clings to walls long after a murder, lingered still. Some said the pestilence was a punishment for hidden sins. Others swore it was a poison in the air, a corruption of the humors that only the learned physicians might cure, though too often those same physicians were the first to fall. Leora did not know what to believe anymore. Her village priest had fled before Easter, promising he would return with holy relics and prayers strong enough to turn death aside. He had not returned, nor had any relics come. Outside, a horse's hooves crunched through fallen leaves. Leora startled, clutching her cloak tight about her shoulders. Visitors were rare now. Most had barricaded themselves behind barred doors, fearful of both stranger and kin. She peered through the narrow slit of her wooden shutter. A lone rider sat slumped upon a mottled gray mare, the beast's ribs stark beneath its matted coat. The rider's hood was drawn low, but even from within the gloom, Leora sensed something more than mere exhaustion in the figure's bent posture. She hesitated at her threshold, fingers brushing the iron latch. Hospitality was an old law, older than kings and popes, a law that spoke from the days when hearth fires alone held back the dark. Yet fear too was a law these days, stronger perhaps than any ancient custom. She pressed her forehead to the door, listening to the shuffle of the horse's hooves, the faint groan as the rider slipped to the frozen earth. Then a ragged voice rose, a plea, cracked and dry as old parchment. Please, water, a warm fire. Something inside her loosened. She lifted the latch, bracing against the gust of chill air that swept in. There on the ground lay a man no older than herself, though the lines of strain carved deep furrows beside his mouth and eyes. His cloak was caked in mud, his boots worn through at the soles. He clutched a leather satchel, bound tight with fraying cords. Leora helped him inside, her thin arms straining beneath his weight. She laid him beside the hearth, where the embers still glowed faintly, then fed the fire with the last of her kindling. As warmth returned to the small stone room, the man's breathing steadied, though his eyes remained closed. She fetched water from a clay jug, trickling it between his cracked lips. When at last he stirred, he opened eyes so dark they seemed to drink in the flicker of the firelight. "You are kind," he murmured, his voice soft, yet burdened with some private sorrow. "I have come far, over hill and river, seeking news, seeking hope, if any is left." Leora sat cross-legged beside him, her fingers pressed to her mouth, as if to hold back the questions that rose like smoke within her. "What news do you carry, stranger? What is left out there, beyond these woods?" He pulled the satchel closer, as though guarding a treasure. With trembling fingers, he loosened the knots and drew forth a sheaf of parchment. The pages were stained with rain and time, ink smeared where tears or the weather had blurred the words. He did not offer them to her just yet, but pressed them to his chest. "I am a scribe," he said, voice faltering. "Or was. I wrote letters for those who could not write, testaments, final confessions, last words to families who might never hear them spoken aloud. When the pestilence came, I thought my words might hold back despair, but there were too many dying. So many I could not keep up. And yet I kept these. Stories of the places I passed through. Villages where whole families locked themselves in and never opened the door again. Town squares where the only sounds were the wings of crows." His eyes found hers in the wavering light. "Do you wish to hear them? Or shall I burn them and their sorrow with them?" Leora did not speak. She reached instead for a clay mug, filled it with the last of her thin ale, and pressed it into his hands. She feared words. Words brought memories that had been easier to bury beneath the hush of the wind and the crackle of the fire. But as he sipped, she found her voice returning, quiet and tentative. "Read to me," she whispered at last. "If you carry the burden, let me carry it too. If the world is ending, I would know how it came undone." So he began. His voice was weak at first, like a river in drought, but it grew steadier as the night wore on. He spoke of cities where carts creaked under piles of bodies, of children abandoned on doorsteps, crying for mothers who would never return. He told her of wandering bands of flagellants who struck themselves bloody in the belief that suffering might redeem them all, of monks who fled their abbeys in terror, leaving altars cold and candles snuffed. Yet within his stories, there flickered embers of grace too. He spoke of midwives who braved plague-stricken houses to cradle the dying, of neighbors who shared their last crusts of bread, though their own stomachs howled with hunger. He spoke of hope rising stubbornly in the soil, as peasants planted seeds though they knew not if spring would come for them to see it bloom. Leora listened until her head drooped against the stones of the hearth. She dreamed of crows wheeling over empty fields, of churches with doors flung wide, and wind singing through the rafters. And she dreamed, too, of green shoots pushing through black earth, fragile promises that the world, though wounded and grieving, might yet endure. When she woke, dawn painted the frost-silvered fields beyond her shutter. The scribe lay beside the hearth, the last pages of his parchment resting beneath his slack hand. Leora rose, fed the fire once more, and sat again by his side. There were more pages to read, more shadows to face, but for the first time in many nights, she did not feel so terribly alone. The morning crept in with the hush of drifting fog, curling like ghostly lace through the cracks of Leora's shuttered windows. The scribe slept still, his chest rising and falling in an uneasy rhythm, as if his dreams carried him through grim corridors of memory he could not yet flee. Leora moved softly around him, adding splinters of dry wood to the fire, until its warmth brushed her cheeks with a gentle flush. The silence of the house was broken only by the distant call of a crow perched on the thatch outside, its voice hoarse with the cold. She stepped out into the yard, where frost clung to the grass like a fine dusting of flour upon a baker's table. In the small pen behind her cottage, 2 chickens scratched listlessly at the frozen earth. She whispered to them as she scattered what little feed remained, her breath rising in soft plumes. Overhead, the sky lay low and gray, pressing close like a damp woolen cloak. When she returned inside, the scribe was stirring. He lay with his eyes open, blinking at the ceiling beams, as though they were branches of some distant forest he could not name. When his gaze found hers, he managed the smallest smile, a fragile curl of the lips that spoke of both weariness and quiet gratitude. "I dreamt I was at my mother's hearth," he murmured, his voice rough with sleep. She used to say that a heart's warmth was proof the world could be kind, even when the wind howled at the door. Leora knelt beside him and offered him a small cup of broth she had managed to coax from a bit of dried root and a scrap of salted meat. It was thin, barely more than warm water flavored by memory, but he drank it as though it were a king's feast. He unrolled the remaining parchment and spread it between them upon the floor, smoothing the pages with reverent hands. The fire's light danced across the ink, picking out lines written in hurried script, stories caught in moments when fear and despair made the pen tremble. "This one," he said, tapping a corner with a dirt-caked fingernail, "was told to me by an old nun I met at the edge of the forest near St. Mary's Abbey. She had stayed behind when the rest fled. She said the walls of her abbey were older than fear, older than plague. She refused to abandon them." He drew a slow breath, as though gathering the nun's courage back into himself. She spoke of how the pestilence crept through the cloisters, how it took the novices first, the youngest, the brightest, those who still laughed in the gardens when spring came. She told me how she bathed their brows, whispered prayers into ears gone deaf to the world's sighing. She said that when the bells fell silent, when no hand was left to pull their ropes, she rang them herself so the world would remember the dead. Leora listened with eyes wide and unblinking. She pictured the abbey in her mind's eye, a place of cold stones and warm candlelight, a sanctuary turned sepulchre by the unseen hand of the pestilence. She wondered if the nun still lived, tending empty corridors with whispered psalms, or if she too had lain down her burdens in the hush of some forgotten cell. The scribe's fingers traced another page. "I met a shepherd too," he continued, his voice softer now as though afraid to wake the ghosts hidden in the lines. "He told me of the hills beyond the river where he once drove his flock. When the sickness came, he fled deeper into the highlands, thinking the wind might spare him. But the wind carried it all the same, carried sorrow over crags and through passes into caves where he hid with his ewes. He said he buried his wife beneath a cairn of loose stones, high enough that no beast would dare disturb her sleep." He fell silent then, eyes shimmering with unwept tears that seemed to catch the heart's glow like tiny mirrors of grief. Leora reached out, her fingers brushing his wrist, an anchor, a wordless promise that he was not alone here. She gathered the pages to her lap and smoothed them gently, as though by touching them she might soothe the suffering they held. "Do you think," she asked, her voice barely above the crackle of the fire, "that these stories will be remembered, or will they vanish when you are gone?" The scribe closed his eyes, drawing in the warmth of the hearth and her closeness. "If no one remembers them," he said, "then all this dying will have been for nothing. But if even one voice carries them forward, then perhaps the darkness does not win entirely." They sat together as the day bled into afternoon, the light pale and fleeting. Outside, the crow's caw echoed again and again, a lonely herald of a world that still turned, even if so much of it had fallen silent. Leora rose once to fetch more water, pouring it over the withered herbs she kept bundled by the window. The faint scent of rosemary drifted through the room, a fragile fragrance, stubbornly alive. When she returned to the hearth, the scribe had begun to write anew. He used the stub of a quill he'd kept wrapped in cloth, dipping it into the ink he rationed as if it were holy oil. His words scratched out steadily across a scrap of clean parchment she had offered, a piece torn from the back of an old prayer book, whose pages were brittle and yellowed by age. He wrote of Leora's kindness, of the hearth that had welcomed him when the roads offered only wind and ruin. He wrote of her silence, too, the way she listened without judgment or interruption, as though her very presence might knit the world back together, stitch by careful stitch. As dusk gathered, he paused and looked at her, this girl who had buried her mother and father with her own hands, yet opened her door to a stranger who carried nothing but ink and sorrow. "Would you keep these pages?" he asked. "If I cannot carry them farther, will you guard them for me? Read them when you are lonely, and remember the ones who came before." Leora nodded, pressing her hand over his as if to seal a pact older than plague or fear, the promise that stories once given must never be left to die. That night, as darkness draped its velvet shawl over the village and the frost crept silently across the thatched roofs, Leora lay awake beside the hearth. The scribe slept once more, his breath shallow yet steady, the parchment pages gathered like a fragile nest beneath his hand. Outside, the wind sighed through the bare branches, a lullaby for a land too tired to dream. Leora's mind wandered far beyond her little cottage. She thought of the nun who rang the silent bells, of the shepherd with sorrow, buried beneath stones high upon the hills. She pictured the market squares, where once voices rose in laughter and barter, now left to the crows and the drifting ash of funeral pyres. Each tale lived inside her chest now, a small, flickering flame that she could not allow to die. When the fire sank to embers, she rose, wrapped herself in her mother's old shawl, and stepped outside. The night air bit at her cheeks and nose, but she hardly noticed. Overhead, the sky had cleared, revealing a scatter of stars that gleamed like distant lanterns hung by merciful hands. She tilted her face to the sky, drawing a breath so deep it almost hurt. Down the path, near the crooked fence that bordered her little yard, she saw a figure, no more than a shadow at first. Her heart lurched, for the world no longer welcomed strangers kindly. Yet something gentle in the figure's posture kept her feet rooted where she stood. It was an old woman, wrapped in a heavy cloak, a wicker basket looped over one stooped arm. The stranger paused just beyond the fence, lifting a hand in greeting rather than demand. Her voice drifted across the brittle grass, thin yet certain. "Is it true, child? Do you shelter the scribe?" Leora's tongue felt thick in her mouth, but she found her words. "He sleeps by my hearth. He carries the stories of the dead." The old woman stepped closer, her feet muffled by the frost-hardened earth. Within the basket, Leora glimpsed a bundle of herbs tied neat with twine and a small clay pot sealed with wax. The scent of sage and lavender spilled from the basket's rim, weaving itself with the cold night air. "I have come to trade, if you'll allow," the woman said. "I am called Mirren. Once I was midwife to 3 villages, but now there are no babes born, only graves to tend. Still, these hands know their work." She set the basket down by Leora's feet, then pulled aside the cloth that covered the pot. Inside was a thick balm, fragrant with beeswax and rosemary oil. "For his chest," Mirren explained, nodding towards the cottage. "The pestilence robs the breath first, steals it in the night. This will ease the rattling, if not cure it outright." Leora felt her throat tighten. "What do you ask in return?" Mirren's eyes, dark and sharp beneath her hood, flicked towards the shuttered window where the fire's faint glow bled through the cracks. "His words," she said softly. "A single page, copied in your hand, if he cannot spare his own. I have tended too many deaths alone. I would keep a piece of this sorrow, so I do not forget why we endure." Leora knelt beside the basket, her hands brushing the soft heads of dried lavender. "I will write for you," she promised. "Come inside, warm your bones." But Mirren shook her head, pulling her cloak tighter. "I have more doors to knock upon before dawn. Not all hearts have yet shut themselves away. Some, like yours, remember that warmth is the only gift we may give freely when all else is lost." She turned then, her steps slow but sure as she vanished down the path, leaving the frost unbroken behind her. Leora stood in the hush that followed, the basket heavy in her hands, her breath a pale wisp among the shadows. Inside once more, she stirred the embers back to life, then warmed the balm in her palms. She knelt by the scribe's side and smoothed it over his chest, the scent of rosemary filling the small room like a whispered blessing. He murmured in his sleep, words half-formed and lost to dreams. She did not wake him. Instead, she found a scrap of parchment and the stub of a quill. By the firelight, she copied his words, carefully, faithfully, each letter shaped with the reverence one might give to prayer. She paused only to listen for the sound of his breath, steady now beneath the layers of wool. When the page was done, she folded it into a square and placed it by the door, ready for Mirren to claim on her quiet rounds. Outside, the crow cawed once, a lonely note against the hush of snow that had begun to fall in fine, drifting flakes. As the flakes settled upon the roof, Leora pressed her palm to the pages the scribe had left in her care. She felt the weight of them, heavier than any stone, yet light enough to carry on a breath. She closed her eyes and made herself a promise that come spring, should spring ever dare return, she would carry these stories beyond the woods, over the hills, into villages that might still stand. She would speak their names, so the silence could not swallow them whole. In the glow of her little hearth, with the frost whispering secrets at the door, Leora watched over the scribe and all the voices he carried. Guardian of sorrow, keeper of flame, dreamer of a world reborn from the ashes of the plague. Winter deepened its grip upon the land, laying a hush of snow and silence over fields once furrowed by plow and footfall alike. Leora's cottage, small and humble as it was, became a hidden lantern in a world grown cold and still. Each dawn she woke before the pale sun, tending the fire with sticks gathered from the woods, her breath mingling with the thin smoke that drifted up through the chimney stones. Beside the hearth, the scribe lingered between waking and sleep, caught in that fragile place where memory and fever weave their own shadows. Some nights he roused enough to take broth from her hands, to offer a few slurred words of gratitude or a line of verse half remembered from a psalm once sung in grand cathedrals. Other nights he lay silent, his breath a whisper of wind against the hush. Leora tended him as she had tended her mother and father, gently, without complaint. She pressed cool cloths to his brow, mixed the balm Mirren had left with warm oil, and rubbed it into his chest until his breath came easier. When he slept deeply enough, she would sit beside him, quill in hand, and copy his pages word for word so that none of his stories would vanish into the dark with him. On the coldest mornings, she stepped outside to find footprints in the snow. Faint, drifting trails that told her Mirren had come again, leaving bundles of dried herbs, wrapped in scraps of cloth, beneath the shelter of the eaves. No knock disturbed the door, no voice called her name. Only these quiet offerings, given freely by hands that had guided both birth and death in equal measure. One such morning, as snow drifted down like ash from some distant, silent pyre, Leora found at her threshold a scrap of parchment weighed down with a small stone. Upon it, in a hand not her own, were words inked in careful, trembling lines. When the last bell is rung and the fields lie fallow, when no lamb cries at dawn, nor plow breaks the earth's hollow, remember us, voices carried on wind and ember. Keep our names, gentle keeper. Teach the next to remember. She folded the note and tucked it among the pages she kept wrapped in cloth beside her pillow. Though her fingers ached from the cold and her stomach often growled from want, she felt stronger for the weight of these words, an inheritance not of coin nor land, but of memory that no plague could claim. By midwinter's heart, when the river froze solid enough to bear the weight of deer and wandering fox alike, the scribe stirred at last from the fever's clutch. His eyes opened clearer than they had in weeks, though their darkness was ringed by the hollows of long hunger. He found Leora by the hearth, her knees drawn to her chest as she dozed beside the dwindling glow. "Leora," he rasped, his voice brittle as dry reeds. She startled awake, blinking the dreams from her lashes. When she saw his eyes upon her, clear and seeing, a smile bloomed on her lips, a small sun breaking through a winter storm. "You've come back to me," she whispered, pressing her palm to his brow. No fever there now, only the gentle warmth of life refusing to leave her hearth. He tried to rise, but she steadied him with gentle hands. "Rest," she said. "You have done enough wandering in your dreams." But he shook his head, his fingers finding hers where they lay against his chest. "I have one more tale to give you," he murmured. "One more, before my words run dry." Leora fetched the quill and parchment, pressing them into his trembling hand. Slowly, painfully, he etched the last of his story, a letter more than a tale, written not to kings or priests, but to those yet unborn, who might one day wonder how the black tide had come and why it had spared so few. If you hold this page, he wrote, know that once there were hearts brave enough to open their doors when all others were shut. Know that hunger and plague could not seal every kindness away. Know that we, who burned our dead in fields and streets, did not forget how to love one another, even as the crows waited on our roofs. When at last his hand fell still, Leora took the parchment and folded it into the growing bundle she kept close to her breast. She lay his hand back upon his chest, whispering a prayer not from any book, but born of her own quiet hope, that this man, who had gathered the sorrow of so many in ink and parchment, might find a peace no plague could touch. In the days that followed, his strength ebbed and flowed like a candle flame trembling on its wick, but he did not fade alone. Leora sat beside him through each hush of night and each gray dawn. When his eyes closed for the final time, it was with her hand in his, her thumb brushing gently over his knuckles like a mother soothing a restless child. She did not weep then. She tended him as she had tended her family, wrapping him in clean cloth, setting a sprig of rosemary beneath his folded hands. When the earth softened in the first thaw of spring, she would bury him beneath the old yew tree at the edge of her field, a place where the snowdrops pushed bravely through the soil, white bells heralding that life, though wounded, would rise again. And when the thaw came, when green returned to the hedgerows and the crows lifted away to seek other harvests, Leora packed the pages into a cloth satchel. She took bread, what little dried meat remained, and the balm jar, now nearly empty. With the cottage shuttered behind her, its hearth cold but not forgotten, she stepped onto the path that wound beyond the woods and the hills. In her heart she carried a vow to speak the names, to tell the stories, to keep the flame, to walk until the plague's shadow no longer lay heavy upon every threshold, to remind the world, should it ever forget, that even in the blackest hours, one soul's kindness could keep the darkness at bay. So she walked through fields once silent, through villages where new children would one day laugh again, past abbey walls and market crosses and wind-bent trees. And wherever she stopped, she opened her satchel, drew forth her pages, and read aloud beneath the wide sky, so the wind might carry the memory far, far beyond the reach of death.